Demon Lord of Karanda, Book 3 of the Malloreon, by David Eddings. Prologue. Being a brief history of Malloria and the races that dwell there. Digested from the Chronicles of Angarak, University of Melcene Press. Tradition places the ancestral home of the Angaraks somewhere off of the south coast of present-day Dalasia. Then Torak, dragon god of Angarak, used the power of the stone, Thragyaska, in what has come to be called the cracking of the world. The crust of the earth split, releasing liquid magma from below and letting the waters of the southern ocean in to form the Sea of the East. This cataclysmic process continued for decades before the world gradually assumed its present form. As a result of this upheaval, the Aelorns and their allies were forced to retreat into the unexplored reaches of the western continent, while the Angaraks fled into the wilderness of Malloria. Torak had been maimed and disfigured by the stone, which rebelled at the use to which the god put it, and the Grolem priests were demoralized. Thus, leadership fell by default to the military. By the time the Grolems recovered, the military had established de facto rule of all of Angarak. Lacking their former preeminence, the priests set up an opposing center of power at Malyaska, near the tip of the Karandese mountain range. At this point, Torak roused himself to prevent the imminent civil war between priesthood and military rule. But he made no move against the military headquarters at Malzeth. Instead, he marched to the extreme northwest of Malloria Antiqua, with a quarter of the Angarak people to build the holy city of Xtol-Mishrak. There he remained, so absorbed by efforts to gain control of Thragyaska that he was oblivious to the fact that the people had largely turned from their previous preoccupation with theological matters. Those with him in Xtol-Mishrak were mostly a hysterical fringe of fanatics under the rigid control of Torak's 3 disciples, Zadar, Tuchik, and Irvon. These 3 maintained the old forms in the society of Xtol-Mishrak, while the rest of Angarak changed. When the continuing friction between the church and military finally came to Torak's attention, he summoned the military high command and the Grolem hierarchy to Xtol-Mishrak and delivered his commands in terms that brooked no demur. Exempting only Malyaska and Malzeth, all towns and districts were to be ruled jointly by the military and priesthood. The subdued hierarchy and high command immediately settled their differences and returned to their separate enclaves. This enforced truce freed the generals to turn their attention to other peoples living in Malloria. The origin of these peoples are lost in myth, but 3 races had predated the Angaraks on the continent: the Dalasians of the southwest, the Karans of the north, and the Melcenes of the east. It was to the Karans the military turned its efforts. The Karans were a warlike race with little patience for cultural niceties. They lived in crude cities where hogs roamed freely in the muddy streets. Traditionally, they were related to the Morindum of the far north of Gorognodrak. Both races were given to the practice of demon worship. At the beginning of the 2nd millennium, roving bands of Karandese brigands had become a serious problem along the eastern frontier, and the Angarak army now moved out of Malzeth to the western fringes of the Karandese kingdom of Palia. The city of Rakand in southwestern Palia was sacked and burned, and the inhabitants were taken captives. At this point, one of the greatest decisions of Angarak history was made. While the Grolems prepared for an orgy of human sacrifice, the generals paused. They had no desire to occupy Palia, and the difficulties of long-distance communication made the notion unattractive. To the generals it seemed far better to keep Palia as a subject kingdom and exact tribute, rather than to occupy a depopulated territory. The Grolems were outraged, but the generals were adamant. Ultimately, both sides agreed to take the matter before Torak for his decision. Not surprisingly, Torak agreed with the high command. If the Karans could be converted, he would nearly double the congregation of his church, as well as the size of his army, for any future confrontations with the kings of the West.
"Any man who liveth in boundless Malloria
shall bow down and worship me," he told his reluctant missionaries. And to ensure their zeal, he sent Urvan to Malyaska to oversee the conversion of the Karans. There, Urvan established himself as temporal head of the Malloreon church in pomp and luxury hitherto unknown to the ascetic Grolums. The army moved against Ketakor, Geno, and Delshin, as well as Palya. But the missionaries fared poorly, as the Karandese magicians conjured up hordes of demons, calling upon them to defend their society. Urvan finally journeyed to Tol Mishrak to consult with Torak. It is not clear what Torak did, but the Karandese magicians soon discovered that the spells previously used to control the demons were no longer effective. Any magician could now reach into the realm of darkness only at the peril of life and soul. The conquest of the Karans absorbed the attention of both military and priesthood for the next several centuries. But ultimately, the resistance collapsed, and Karanda became a subject nation, its peoples generally looked upon as inferiors. When the army advanced down the great river Magan against the Melsene Empire, however, it met a sophisticated and technologically superior people. In several disastrous battles in which the Melsene war chariots and elephant cavalry destroyed whole battalions, the Angaraks abandoned their efforts. The Angarak generals made overtures of peace. To their astonishment, the Melsenes quickly agreed to normalize relations and offered to trade horses, which the Angaraks previously lacked. They refused, however, even to discuss the sale of elephants. The army then turned to Dalesia, which proved to be an easy conquest. The Dalesians were simple farmers and herdsmen with little skill for war. The Angaraks moved into Dalesia and established military protectorates during the next 10 years. The priesthood seemed at first equally successful. The Dalesians meekly accepted the forms of Angarak worship. But they were a mystical people, and the Grolums soon discovered that the power of the witches, seers, and prophets remained unbroken. Moreover, copies of the infamous Malloreon Gospels still circulated in secret among the Dalesians. In time, the Grolums might have succeeded in stamping out the secret Dalesian religion. But then, a disaster occurred that was to change forever the complexion of Angarak life. Somehow, the legendary sorcerer, Belgarath, accompanied by 3 Elorns, succeeded in evading all of the security measures and came unobserved at night to steal Thragyaska from the iron tower of Torak in the center of Tol Mishrak. Although pursued, they managed to escape with the stolen stone to the west. In furious rage, Torak destroyed his city. Then he ordered that the Murgos, the Tulls, and the Nadraks be sent to the western borders of the Sea of the East. More than 1 million lives were lost in the crossing of the northern land bridge, and the society and the culture of the Angaraks took long to recover. Following the dispersal and the destruction of Tol Mishrak, Torak became almost inaccessible, concentrating totally on various schemes to thwart the growing power of the kingdoms of the West. The gods' neglect gave the military time to exploit fully its now virtually total control of Malloria and the subject kingdoms. For many centuries, the uneasy peace between Angaraks and Melsenes continued, broken occasionally only by little wars in which both sides avoided committing their full forces. The two nations eventually established the practice of each sending children of the leaders to be raised by leaders of the other side. This led to a fuller understanding by both, as well as to the growth of a body of cosmopolitan youths that eventually became the norm for the ruling class of the Malloreon Empire. One such youth was Kalath, the son of a high-ranking Angarak general. Brought up in Melsene, he returned to Melzeth to become the youngest man ever to be elevated to the general staff. Returning to Melsene, he married the daughter of the Melsene emperor and managed to have himself declared emperor following the old man's death in 3830. Then, using the Melsene army as a threat, he managed to get himself declared hereditary commander-in-chief of the Angaraks. The integration of Melsene and Angarak was turbulent, but in time, the Melsene patience won out over Angarak brutality. Unlike other peoples, the Melsenes were ruled by a bureaucracy, and in the end, that bureaucracy proved far more efficient than the Angarak military administration. By 4400, the ascendancy of the bureaucracy was complete. By that time, also, the title of Commander-in-Chief had been forgotten, and the ruler of both peoples was simply the Emperor of Maloria. To the sophisticated Melsenes, the worship of Torak remained largely superficial. They accepted the forms out of expediency, but the Grolums were never able to command the abject submission to the dragon god that had characterized the Angaraks. Then, in 4850, Torak suddenly emerged from his aeons of seclusion to appear before the gates of Malzeth. Wearing a steel mask to conceal his maimed face, he set aside the emperor and declared himself Kal Torak, king and god. He immediately began mustering an enormous force to crush the kingdoms of the West and bring all the world under his domination. The mobilization that followed virtually stripped Maloria of able-bodied males. The Angaraks and Karans were marched north to the land bridge, crossing to the northernmost Garag Nadrak, and the Delesians and Melsenes moved to where fleets had been constructed to ferry them across the Sea of the East to southern Tholmyrgos. The northern Malorians joined with the Nadraks, the Tulls, and the northern Murgos to strike toward the kingdoms of Thrasnia and Algeria. The second group of Malorians joined with southern Murgos and were to march northwesterly. Torak meant to crush the west between the two huge armies. The southern forces, however, were caught in a freak storm that swept in off of the western sea in the spring of 4875, that buried them alive in the worst blizzard of recorded history. When it finally abated, the column was mired in 14-foot snowdrifts that persisted until early summer. No theory has yet been able to explain this storm, which was clearly not of natural origin. Whatever the cause, the southern army perished. The few survivors who struggled back to the east told tales of horror that were truly unthinkable. The northern force was also beset by various disasters, but eventually laid siege to Vomimbre, where they were completely routed by the combined armies of the west. And there, Torak was struck down by the power of Tragyaska, there called the Orb of Aldur, and lay in a coma that was to last centuries, though his body was rescued and taken to a secret hiding place by his disciple Zadar. In the years following these catastrophes, Malloreon society began to fracture back into its original components of Melsene, Karanda, Dalesia, and the lands of the Angaraks. The empire was saved only by the emergence of Korzeth as emperor. Korzeth was only 14 when he seized the throne from his aged father. Deceived by his youth, the separatist regions began to declare independence of the imperial throne. Korzeth moved decisively to stem the revolution. He spent the rest of his life on horseback in one of the greatest bloodbaths of history. But when he was done, he delivered a strong and united Maloria to his successors. Henceforth, the descendants of Korzeth ruled in total and unquestioned power from Malzeth. This continued until the present emperor, Zakath, ascended the throne. For a time he gave promise of being an enlightened ruler of Maloria and the western kingdoms of the Angaraks. But soon there were signs of trouble. The Murgos were ruled by Taur-Urgas, and it was evident that he was both mad and unscrupulously ambitious. He instigated some plot against the young emperor. It has never been established clearly what form his scheming took, but Zakath discovered that Taur-Urgas was behind it, and vowed vengeance. This took the form of a bitter war, in which Zakath began a campaign to destroy the mad ruler utterly. It was in the middle of this struggle that the West struck. While the kings of the West sent an army against the East, Belgarion, the young overlord of the West and descendant of Belgarath the sorcerer, advanced on foot across the north and across the land bridge into Maloria. He was accompanied by Belgarath and a Drasnian, and he bore the ancient sword of Riva, on the pommel of which was Thragyaska, the orb of Aldur. His purpose was to slay Torak, apparently in response to some prophecy known in the West. Torak had been emerging from his long coma in the ruins of his ancient city of Tol Mishrak. Now he roused himself to meet the challenger, but in the confrontation, Belgarion overcame the god and slew him with the sword, leaving the priesthood of Malloria in chaos and confusion. Part 1. Rak Hagga, Chapter 1. The first snow of the season settled white and quiet through the breathless air onto the decks of their ship. It was a wet snow with large, heavy flakes that piled up on the lines and rigging, turning the tarred ropes into thick white cables. The sea was black. The swells rose and fell without sound. From the stern came the slow, measured beat of a muffled drum that set the stroke for the Malloreon oarsmen. The sifting flakes settled on the shoulders of the sailors, and in the folds of their scarlet cloaks as they pulled steadily through the snowy morning. Their breath steamed in the chill dampness as they bent and straightened in unison to the beat of the drum. Geryon and Silk stood at the rail with their cloaks about their shoulders, staring somberly out through the filmy snowfall. "Miserable morning," the rat-faced little Drasnian noted, distastefully brushing snow from his shoulders. Geryon grunted sourly. "Oh, but you're in a cheerful humor today." "I don't really have all that much to smile about, Silk." Geryon went back to glowering at the gloomy black-and-white morning. Belgarath the sorcerer came out of the aft cabin, squinting up into the thickly settling snow, and raising the hood of his stout old cloak. Then he came forward, along the slippery deck, to join them at the rail. Silk glanced at the red-cloaked Malloreon soldier who had, unobtrusively, came up onto deck behind the old man, and who now stood leaning with some show of idleness on the rail several yards aft. "I see that General Ateska is still concerned about your well-being," he said, pointing at the man who had dogged Belgarath's steps since they had sailed out of the harbor at Rak Hagga. Belgarath threw a quick, disgusted glance in the soldier's direction. "Stupidity," he said shortly. "Where does he think I'm going?" A sudden thought came to Geryon. He leaned forward and spoke very quietly. "You know," he said, "we could go someplace at that. We have got a ship here, and a ship goes wherever you point it. Malloria, just as easily as the coast of Hagga." "Oh, it's an interesting notion, Belgarath," Silk agreed. "There are 4 of us, Grandfather," Geryon pointed out. "You, me, Aunt Paul, and Dernick. I'm sure we wouldn't have much difficulty in taking over this ship. Then we could change course and be halfway to Malloria before Kalzakath realized that we were not coming to Rak Hagga after all." The more he thought about it, the more the idea excited him. Then we could sail north along the Malloreon coast, anchor in a cove or inlet someplace on the shore of Kamat. We'd only be a week or so from Ashaba. We might even be able to get there before Xandramos does. A bleak smile touched his lips. "I would sort of like to be waiting for her when she gets there." "Oh, it's got definite possibilities, Belgarath," Silk said. "Could you do it?" Belgarath scratched thoughtfully at his beard, squinting out into the sifting snow. "It's possible," he admitted. He looked at Geryon. "But what do you think we ought to do with all of these Malloreon soldiers and the ship's crew once we get to the coast of Kamat? You weren't planning to sink the ship and drown them all, were you? The way Xandramos does when she has finished using people?" "Well, of course not." "Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. But then how did you plan to keep them from running to the nearest garrison just as soon as we leave them behind? I don't know about you, but the idea of having a regiment or so of Malloreon troops hot on our heels does not excite me all that much." Geryon frowned. "I guess I hadn't thought about that," he admitted.
I didn't think you had. It's usually best to work your way completely through an idea before you put it into action. It avoids a great deal of spur-of-the-moment patching later on.
"All right," Geryon said, feeling slightly embarrassed.
I know you're impatient, Geryon, but impatience is a poor substitute for a well-considered plan.
"Do you mind, grandfather?" Geryon said acidly.
Besides, it might just be that we are supposed to go to Rak Hagga and meet with Kalzakath. Why would Saradas turn us over to the Malloreons after she went to all of the trouble of putting the Book of Ages into my hands? There is something else going on here, and I'm not sure we want to disrupt things until we find out a little more about them."
The cabin door opened, and General Ataska, the commander of the Malloreon forces, occupying the Isle of Verkat, emerged. From the moment they had been turned over to him, Ataska had been polite and strictly correct in all of his dealings with them. He had also been very firm about his intention to deliver them personally to Kalzakath and Rak Hagga. He was a tall, lean man, and his uniform was bright scarlet, adorned with numerous medals and decorations. He carried himself with erect dignity, though the fact that his nose had been broken at some time in the past made him look more like a street brawler than a general in an imperial army. He came up the slush-covered deck, heedless of his highly polished boots.
"Good morning, gentlemen,"
he greeted them with a stiff military bow.
"I trust you slept well."
"Tolerably," Silk replied.
"It seems to be snowing,"
the general said, looking about and speaking in the tone of one making small talk for the sake of courtesy.
"Oh, I noticed that," Silk said. "How long is it likely to take us to reach Rak Hagga?" "A few more hours to reach the coast, Your Highness, and then a 2-day ride to the city."
Silk nodded. "Have you any idea why your emperor wants to see us?" he asked.
"He didn't say,"
Ataska answered shortly.
"And I did not think it appropriate to ask. He merely told me to apprehend you, and to bring you to him at Rak Hagga. You are all to be treated with utmost courtesy as long as you do not try to escape. If you do that, His Imperial Majesty instructed me to be more firm."
His tone as he spoke was neutral, and his face remained expressionless.
"I hope you gentlemen will excuse me now," he said. "I have some matters that need my attention."
He bowed curtly, turned, and left them.
"Oh, he's a gold mine of information, isn't he?"
Silk noted dryly. "Most Melsines love to gossip, but you've got to pry every word out of this one."
"Melsine?" Geryon said. "I didn't know that."
Silk nodded. "Ataska's a Melsine name. Kalzakath has some peculiar ideas about the aristocracy of talent. Angarak officers don't like the idea, but there's not too much they can do about it, if they want to keep their heads." Geryon was not really that curious about the intricacies of Malloreon politics, so he let the matter drop, to return to the subject that had been being discussed previously.
"I'm not quite clear about what you were saying, grandfather. About our going to Rak Hagga, I mean?"
"Saradas believes that she has a choice to make," the old man replied. "And there are certain conditions that have to be met before she can make it. I have got a suspicion that your meeting with Zakath might be one of those conditions."
"You don't actually believe her, do you?"
"I have seen stranger things happen, and I always walk very softly around the seers of Kel."
"I haven't seen anything about a meeting of that kind in the Mrin Codex."
"Neither have I. But there are more things in the world than the Mrin Codex. You've got to keep in mind the fact that Saradas is drawing on the prophecies of both sides, and if the prophecies are equal, they have equal truth. Not only that, Saradis is probably drawing on some prophecies that only the seers know about. Wherever this list of preconditions came from, though, I'm fairly certain that she won't let us get to this place, which is no more, until every item has been crossed off of her list.
Won't let us? Silk said.
Do not underestimate Saradis, Silk, Belgarath cautioned. She is the receptacle of all of the power of the Dals, and that means that she can probably do things the rest of us could not even begin to dream of. Let us look at things from a practical point of view, though. When we started out, we were half a year behind Xandromos, and we were planning a very tedious and time-consuming trek across Tolmurgos. But we kept getting interrupted.
Oh, tell me about it, Silk said sardonically.
Isn't it curious that after all of those interruptions, we have reached the eastern side of the continent ahead of schedule, and have cut Xandromos's lead down to a few weeks?
Silk blinked. Then his eyes narrowed. Yes. Gives you something to think about, doesn't it? The old man pulled his cloak more tightly about him. He looked again around at the settling snow.
Let's go inside, he suggested. It is really unpleasant out here.
The coast of Hagga was backed by low hills, filmy-looking and white in the thick snowfall. There were extensive salt marshes at the water's edge, and the brown reeds bent under their burden of wet, clinging snow. A black-looking wooden pier extended out across the marshes to deeper water, and they disembarked from the Malloreon ship without incident. At the landward end of the pier, a wagon track ran up into the hills, its twin ruts buried in snow. Sadi, the eunuch, looked upward with a slightly bemused expression as they rode off of the pier and onto the road. He lightly brushed one long-fingered hand across his shaved scalp. "They feel like fairy wings," he smiled. "What's that?" Silk asked him. "The snowflakes. I've almost never seen snow before, only when I was visiting a northern kingdom, and I actually believe that this is the first time I have ever been out of doors when it was snowing. It's not too bad, is it?" Silk gave him a sour look. "The first chance I get, I'll buy you a sled." Sadi looked puzzled. "Excuse me, Keldar, but what is a sled?" Silk sighed. "Oh, never mind, Sadi. I was only trying to be funny." At the top of the first hill, a dozen or so crosses leaned at various angles beside the road. Hanging from each cross was a skeleton, with a few tattered rags clinging to its bleached bones, and a clump of snow crowning its vacant-eyed skull. "One is curious to know the reason for that, General Ataska," Sadi said mildly, pointing at the grim display at the roadside. "Policy, Your Excellency," Ataska replied curtly. "His Imperial Majesty seeks to alienate the Murgos from their king. He hopes to make them realize that Urgot is the cause of their misfortunes." Sadi shook his head dubiously. "I would question the reasoning behind that particular policy," he disagreed. "Atrocities seldom endear one to the victims. I have always preferred bribery myself." "Murgos are accustomed to being treated atrociously," Ataska shrugged. "It is all they understand." "Why haven't you taken them down and buried them?" Durnick demanded, his face pale and his voice thick with outrage. Ataska gave him a long, steady look. "Economy, Goodman," he replied. "An empty cross really does not prove very much. If we took them down, we would just have to replace them with fresh Murgos. That gets to be tedious after a while, and sooner or later, one starts to run out of people to crucify. Leaving the skeletons there proves our point.
and it saves time.
Geryon did his best to keep his body between Tsinedra and the gruesome object lesson at the side of the road, trying to shield her from that hideous sight. She rode on obliviously, however, her face strangely numb, and her eyes blank and unseeing. He threw a quick, questioning glance at Polgara, and saw a slight frown on her face. He dropped back and pulled his horse in beside hers. "What's wrong with her?" he asked in a tense whisper. "I am not entirely sure, Geryon," she whispered back. "Is it the melancholia again?" There was a sick, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. "I don't think so." Her eyes were narrowed in thought. She absently pulled the hood of her blue robe forward to cover the white lock in the midnight of her hair. "I will keep an eye on her." "Well, what can I do?" "Stay with her. Try to get her to talk. She might say something to give us clues." Tsinedra, however, made few responses to Geryon's efforts to engage her in conversation, and her answers for the remainder of that snowy day quite frequently had little relevance to either his questions or his observations. As evening began to settle over the war-ravaged countryside of Hagga, General Ateska called a halt, and his soldiers began to erect several scarlet pavilions in the lee of a fire-blackened stone wall, all that remained of a burned-out village.
"We should reach Rak Hagga by late tomorrow afternoon," he advised them. "That large pavilion in the center of the encampment will be yours for the night. My men will bring you your evening meal in a little while. Now, if you will all excuse me,"
he inclined his head briefly, then turned his horse around to supervise his men. When the soldiers had completed the erection of the pavilions, Geryon and his friends dismounted in front of the one Ateska had indicated. Silk looked around at the guard detachment moving into position around the large red tent. "I wish that he would make up his mind," he said irritably. "I don't quite follow you, Prince Keldar," Velvet said to him. "Just who should make up his mind?" "Ateska. He is the very soul of courtesy, but he surrounds us with armed guards." "The troops might just be there to protect us, Keldar," she pointed out. "This is a war zone, after all." "Oh, of course," he said dryly. "And cows might fly, too, if they had wings."
"What a fascinating observation," she marveled.
"Oh, I wish you wouldn't do that all of the time."
"Do what?"
Her brown eyes were wide and innocent. "Oh, forget it." The supper Ateska's cooks prepared for them was plain, consisting of soldiers' rations and served on tin plates, but it was hot and filling. The interior of the pavilion was heated by charcoal braziers and filled with the golden glow of hanging oil lamps. The furnishings were of a military nature, the kinds of tables and beds and chairs that could be assembled and disassembled rapidly, and the floors and walls were covered with Malloreon carpets dyed a solid red color. Geryon looked around curiously after he had pushed his plate back.
"They seem awfully partial to red, don't they?"
"I think it reminds them of blood," Dernick declared bleakly. "They like blood."
He turned to look coldly at the mute Toth.
"Well, if you've finished eating, I think we'd prefer it if you left the table," he said in a flat tone.
"That is hardly polite, Dernick,"
Polgara said reprovingly. "I wasn't trying to be polite, Paul. I don't see why he has to be put in with us in the first place. He's a traitor. Why doesn't he go stay with his friends?"
The giant mute rose from the table, his face melancholy. He lifted one hand, as if he were about to make one of those obscure gestures with which he and the smith communicated. But Dernick deliberately turned his back on him. Toth sighed, and went over to sit unobtrusively in one corner.
"Geryon?"
Tsinedra said suddenly, looking around with a worried little frown.
"Where's my baby?"
He stared at her.
"Where's Geryon?"
she demanded, her voice shrill. "Tsinedra," he started.
"I hear him crying. What have you done with him?"
She suddenly sprang to her feet and began to dash about the tent, flinging back the curtains that partitioned off the sleeping quarters, yanking back the blankets on each bed.
"Help me!"
she cried to them.
"Help me find my baby!"
Geryon crossed the tent quickly to take her by the arm.
"Tsenedra!"
"No!" she shouted at him.
"You have hidden him somewhere. Let me go!"
She wrenched herself free of his grasp and began overturning the furniture in her desperate search, sobbing and moaning unintelligibly. Again Geryon tried to restrain her, but she suddenly hissed at him and extended her fingers like talons to claw at his eyes.
"Tsenedra, stop that!"
But she darted around him and bolted out of the pavilion into the snowy night. As Geryon burst through the tent flap in pursuit, he found his way barred by a red-cloaked Malloreon soldier.
"You get back inside,"
the man barked, blocking Geryon with the shaft of his spear. Over the guard's shoulder, Geryon saw Tsenedra struggling with another soldier. Without even thinking, he smashed his fist into the face in front of him. The guard reeled backward and fell. Geryon leaped over him, but found himself suddenly seized from behind by a half-dozen more men.
"Leave her alone!"
he shouted at the guard, who was cruelly holding one of the little queen's arms behind her.
"Get back outside the tent,"
a rough voice barked, and Geryon found himself being dragged backward step by step toward the tent flap. The soldier holding Tsenedra was half lifting, half pushing her back toward the same place. With a tremendous effort, Geryon got control of himself and coldly began to draw in his will.
"That will be enough!"
Polgara's voice cracked from the doorway to the tent. The soldiers stopped, looking uncertainly at each other and somewhat fearfully at the commanding presence in the doorway.
"Dernick,"
she said then,
"help Geryon bring Tsenedra back inside."
Geryon shook himself free of the restraining hands, and he and Dernick took the violently struggling little queen from the soldier, pulling her back toward the pavilion.
"Sadi,"
Polgara said as Dernick and Geryon entered the tent, with Tsenedra between them.
"Do you have any oret in that case of yours?"
"Certainly, Lady Polgara," the eunuch replied. "But are you sure that oret is appropriate here? I would be more inclined toward naledium, personally."
"I think we have got more than a case of simple hysteria on our hands, Sadi. I want something strong enough to ensure that she does not wake up the minute my back is turned."
"Whatever you think is best, Lady Polgara."
He crossed the carpeted floor, opened his red leather case, and took out a vial of dark blue liquid. Then he went to the table and picked up a cup of water. He looked at her inquiringly. She frowned.
"Make it 3 drops," she decided.
He gave her a slightly startled look, then gravely measured out the dosage. It took several moments of combined effort to get Tsenedra to drink the contents of the cup. She continued to sob and struggle for several moments. But then her struggles grew gradually weaker, and her sobbing lessened. Finally, she closed her eyes with a deep sigh, and her breathing became regular.
"Let's get her to bed,"
Polgara said, leading the way to one of the curtained-off sleeping chambers. Geryon picked up the tiny form of his sleeping wife and followed.
"What's wrong with her, Aunt Paul?"
he demanded, as he laid her gently on the bed.
"I'm not positive,"
Polgara replied, covering Tsenedra with a rough soldier's blanket.
"I will need more time to pin it down." "What can we do?" "Not very much while we are on the road," she admitted candidly. "We'll keep her asleep until we get to Rak Hagga. Once I get her into a more stable situation, I will be able to work on it. Stay with her. I want to talk with Sadi for a few moments."
Geryon sat worriedly by the bed, gently holding his wife's limp little hand while Polgara went back out to consult with the eunuch concerning the various drugs in his case. Then she returned, drawing the drape shut behind her.
"He has most of what I need," she reported quietly. "I will be able to improvise the rest."
She touched Geryon's shoulder and bent forward.
"General Ateska just came in," she whispered to him. "He wants to see you. I would not be too specific about the cause of Tsenedra's attack. We cannot be sure just how much Sakath knows about our reasons for being here, and Ateska's certain to report everything that happens. So watch what you say." He started to protest. "You cannot do anything here, Geryon, and they need you out there. I'll watch her."
"Is she subject to the seizures often?"
Ateska was asking, as Geryon came through the draped doorway. "She's very high-strung," Silk replied. "Sometimes circumstances get the best of her. Polgara knows what to do." Ateska turned to face Geryon.
"Your Majesty,"
he said in a chilly tone,
"I don't appreciate your attacking my soldiers."
"He got in my way, General," Geryon replied. "I don't think I hurt him all that much."
"There is a principle involved, Your Majesty."
"Yes," Geryon agreed, "there is. Give the man my apologies, but advise him not to interfere with me again, particularly when it concerns my wife. I do not really like hurting people, but I can make exceptions when I have to." Ateska's look grew steely, and the gaze Geryon returned was just as bleak. They stared at each other for a long moment.
"With all due respect, Your Majesty,"
Ateska said finally,
"don't abuse my hospitality again."
"Only if the situation requires it, General."
"I will instruct my men to prepare a litter for your wife,"
Ateska said then,
"and let us plan to get an early start tomorrow. If the Queen is ill, we want to get her to Rak Hagga as soon as possible."
"Thank you, General," Geryon replied. Ateska bowed coldly, then turned and left.
"Wouldn't you say that was a trifle blunt, Belgarian?" Sadi murmured. "We are in Ateska's power at the moment."
Geryon grunted. I didn't like his attitude. He looked at Belgarath, whose expression was faintly disapproving. "Well?" he asked.
"I didn't say anything."
"You didn't have to. I could hear you thinking all the way over here."
"Well, then I don't have to say it, do I?" The next day dawned cold and raw, but the snow had stopped. Geryon rode at the side of Zinedra's horse-borne litter with his face mirroring his concern. The road they followed ran northwesterly past more burned-out villages and shattered towns. The ruins were covered with a thick coating of the clinging wet snow that had fallen the previous day, and each of them was encircled by a ring of those grim, occupied crosses and stakes. It was about mid-afternoon when they crested a hill and saw the lead-gray expanse of Lake Hagga stretching far to the north and east. On the near shore was a large walled city.
"Rak Hagga,"
Ateska said with a certain relief. They rode on down the hill toward the city. A brisk wind was blowing in off of the lake, whipping their cloaks about them and tossing the manes of their horses.
"All right, gentlemen,"
Ateska said over his shoulder to his troops.
"Let's form up, and try to look like soldiers."
The red-cloaked Malloreons pulled their horses into a double file and straightened in their saddles. The walls of Rak Hagga had been breached in several places, and the tops of the battlements were chipped and pitted from the storms of steel-tipped arrows that had swept over them. The heavy gates had been burst asunder during the final assault on the city, and hung in splinters from their rusty iron hinges. The guards at the gate drew themselves up and saluted smartly as Ateska led the way into the city. The battered condition of the stone houses within the walls attested to the savagery of the fighting, which had ensued when Rak Hagga had fallen. Many of them stood unroofed to the sky, their gaping soot-blackened windows staring out at the rubble-choked streets. A work-gang of sullen Murgos dragging clanking chains behind them labored to clear the fallen building stones out of the slushy streets under the watchful eyes of a detachment of Malloreon soldiers.
"You know," Silk said, "that's the first time I've ever seen a Murgo actually work. I didn't think they even knew how."
The headquarters of the Malloreon army in Tol Murgos was in a large, imposing yellow brick house near the center of the city. It faced a broad, snowy square, and a marble staircase led up to the main door, with a file of red-cloaked Malloreon soldiers lining each side.
"The former residence of the Murgo military governor of Hagga,"
Sadi noted, as they drew near the house. "Oh, you've been here before, then?" Silk asked. "In my youth," Sadi replied. "Rak Hagga has always been the center of the slave trade." Ateska dismounted and turned to one of his officers.
"Captain,"
he said,
"have your men bring the Queen's litter. Tell them to be very careful."
As the rest of them swung down from their mounts, the captain's men unfastened the litter from the saddles of the 2 horses that had carried it, and started up the marble stairs in General Ateska's wake. Just inside the broad doors stood a polished table, and seated behind it was an arrogant-looking man with angular eyes and an expensive-looking scarlet uniform. Against the far wall stood a row of chairs occupied by bored-looking officials.
"State your business,"
the officer behind the table said brusquely. Ateska's face did not change expression as he silently stared at the officer.
"I said to state your business."
"Have the rules changed, Colonel?" Ateska asked in a deceptively mild voice.
"Do we no longer rise in the presence of a superior?" "I am too busy to jump to my feet for every petty Malsine official from the outlying districts," the colonel declared.
"Captain," Ateska said flatly to his officer,
"if the colonel is not on his feet in the space of 2 heartbeats, would you be so kind as to cut off his head for me?"
"Yes, sir," the captain replied, drawing his sword even as the startled colonel jumped to his feet.
"Much better," Ateska told him. "Now, let's begin over again. Do you by chance remember how to salute?"
The colonel saluted smartly, though his face was pale.
"Splendid. We will make a soldier of you yet. Now, one of the people I was escorting, a lady of high station, fell ill during our journey. I want a warm, comfortable room prepared for her immediately." "Sir," the colonel protested, "I am not authorized to do that."
"Don't put your sword away just yet, Captain."
"But, General, the members of His Majesty's household staff make all of those decisions. They will be infuriated if I overstep my bounds."
"I will explain it to His Majesty, Colonel," Ateska told him.
"The circumstances are a trifle unusual, but I am sure that he will approve."
The colonel faltered, his eyes filled with indecision.
"Do it, Colonel. Now." "I'll see to it at once, General," the colonel replied, snapping to attention. "You men," he said to the soldiers holding Zenedra's litter, "follow me."
Geryon automatically started to follow the litter, but Polgara took his arm firmly. "No, Geryon. I will go with her. There is nothing you can do right now, and I think Zakath is going to want to talk to you. Just be careful of what you say." And she went off down the hallway behind the litter. "I see that Malloreon society still has its little frictions," Silk said blandly to General Ateska.
"Angarax," Ateska grunted. "Sometimes they have a little difficulty coping with the modern world. Excuse me, Prince Keldar. I want to let His Majesty know that we are here."
He went to a polished door at the other end of the room and spoke briefly with one of the guards. Then he came back.
"The Emperor is being advised of our arrival. I expect that he will see us in a few moments."
A rather chubby, bald-headed man in a plain, though obviously costly brown robe, and with a heavy gold chain about his neck, approached them.
"Ateska, my dear fellow," he greeted the general. "They told me that you are stationed at Rak Hagga. I have some business with the Emperor, Brador. What are you doing in Tol Murgos?"
"Cooling my heels," the chubby man replied.
"I've been waiting for 2 days to see Kelzokath, who is minding the shop at home. I've arranged it so that it more or less runs itself," Brador replied. "The report I have for His Majesty is so vital that I decided to carry it myself." "What could be so earth-shaking that it would drag the chief of the Bureau of Internal Affairs away from the comforts of Malzeth?" "I believe that it's time for His Imperial Exaltedness to tear himself away from his amusements here in Tol Murgos I come back to the capital. Careful, Bredor,
Ateska said with a brief smile.
Your fine-tuned Mercine prejudices are showing. Things are getting grim at home, Ateska,
Bredor said seriously.
I have got to talk with the Emperor. Can you help me to get into Shillium? I will see what I can do. Thank you, my friend,
Bredor said, clasping the general's arm.
The whole fate of the Empire may depend on my persuading Kal Zakath to come back to Malzeth.
General Ateska, one of the spear-armed guards at the polished door said in a loud voice.
His Imperial Majesty will see you and your prisoners now. Very good,
Ateska replied, ignoring the ominous word, prisoners. He looked at Geryon.
The Emperor must be very eager to see you, Your Majesty, he noted. It often takes weeks to gain an audience with him. Shall we go inside?
Chapter 2. Kal Zakath, the Emperor of boundless Maloria, lounged in a red-cushioned chair at the far end of a large plain room. The Emperor wore a simple white linen robe, severe and unadorned. Though Geryon knew that he was at least in his 40s, his hair was untouched by gray, and his face was unlined. His eyes, however, betrayed a kind of dead weariness, devoid of any joy, or even any interest in life. Curled in his lap lay a common mackerel-striped alley cat, her eyes closed and her forepaws alternately kneading his thigh. Although the Emperor himself wore the simplest of clothes, the guards lining the walls all wore steel breastplates deeply inlaid with gold.
My Emperor,
General Ateska said with a deep bow,
I have the honor to present His Royal Majesty, King Belgarion of Riva.
Geryon nodded briefly, and Zakath inclined his head in response.
Our meeting is long overdue, Belgarion, he said in a voice as dead as his eyes. Your exploits have shaken the world.
Yours have also made a certain impression, Zakath? Geryon had decided even before he had left Rak Hagga that he would not perpetuate the absurdity of the Malloreon's self-bestowed Kal. A faint smile touched Zakath's lips.
Ha,
he said in a tone which indicated that he saw through Geryon's attempt to be subtle. He nodded briefly to the others, and his attention finally fixed itself upon the rumpled, untidy form of Geryon's grandfather.
And of course you, sir, would be Belgarath. I am a bit surprised to find you so ordinary-looking. The Grolums of Maloria all agree that you are 100 feet tall, possibly 200, and that you have horns and a forked tail.
I'm in disguise, Belgarath replied with aplomb. Zakath chuckled, though there was little amusement in that almost mechanical sound. Then he looked around with a faint frown.
I seem to note some absences. Queen Senedra fell ill during the journey, Your Majesty,
Ateska advised him.
Lady Polgara is attending to her.
Ill?
Is it serious?
It is difficult to say at this point, Your Imperial Majesty,
Tsari replied unctuously.
But we have given her certain medications, and I have every confidence in Lady Polgara's skill.
Zakath looked at Geryon.
You should have sent word on ahead, Belgarion. I have a healer on my personal staff, a Talesian woman with remarkable gifts. I will send her to the Queen's chamber at once. Our first concern must be your wife's health.
Thank you, Geryon replied with genuine gratitude. Zakath touched a bell pull and spoke briefly with the servant, who responded immediately to his summons.
Please,
the Emperor said then.
Seat yourselves. I have no particular interest in ceremony.
As the guards hastily brought chairs for them, the cat, sleeping on Zakath's lap, half opened her golden eyes and looked around at them. She rose to her paws, arched her back, and yawned. Then she jumped heavily to the floor with an audible grunt, and waddled over to sniff at Arion's fingers. With a faintly amused look, Zakath watched his obviously pregnant cat make her matronly way across the carpet.
"You will note that my cat has been unfaithful to me again."
He sighed in mock resignation.
"It happens fairly frequently, I am afraid, and she never seems to feel the slightest guilt about it."
The cat jumped up into Arion's lap, nestled down, and began to purr contentedly.
"You have grown, boy,"
Zakath said to the young man.
"Have they taught you how to talk as yet?"
"I've picked up a few words, Zakath,"
Arion said in his clear voice.
"I know the rest of you by reputation at least,"
Zakath said then.
"Goodman Turnick and I met on the plains of Mishrak Achtol, and of course I have heard of the Magraven Lissel of Trasnian intelligence, and of Prince Keldar, who strives to become the richest man in the world."
Velvet's graceful curtsy of acknowledgment was not quite so florid as Silk's grandiose bow.
"And here, of course,"
the Emperor continued,
"is Sadi, chief eunuch in the palace of Queen Samisra."
Toddy bowed with a fluid grace. "I must say your Majesty is remarkably well informed," he said in his contralto voice. "You have read us all like an open book."
"My chief of intelligence tries to keep me informed, Tadi. He may not be as gifted as the inestimable javelin of Bakhtor, but he knows about most of what is going on in this part of the world. He has mentioned that huge fellow over in the corner, but so far he has not been able to discover his name."
"He's called Toth,"
Arion supplied.
"He's a mute, so we have to do his talking for him."
"And a Delesian besides,"
Zakath noted.
"A very curious circumstance."
Garion had been closely watching this man. Beneath the polished, urbane exterior, he sensed a kind of subtle probing. The idle greetings, which seemed to be no more than a polite means of putting them at their ease, had a deeper motive behind them. In some obscure way, he sensed that Zakath was somehow testing each of them. The Emperor straightened then.
"You have an oddly assorted company with you, Bulgarian, and you are a long way from home. I am curious about your reasons for being here in Tol Murgos."
"I'm afraid that's a private matter, Zakath."
One of the Emperor's eyebrows rose slightly.
"Under the circumstances, that is hardly a satisfactory answer, Bulgarian. I cannot really take the chance that you are allied with Urget."
"Would you accept my word that I am not?"
"Not until I know a bit more about your visit to Rak Hagga. Urget left there quite suddenly, apparently in your company, and reappeared just as suddenly on the plains of Morth, where he and a young woman led his troops out of an ambush I had gone to a great deal of trouble to arrange. You will have to admit that is a peculiar set of circumstances."
"Not when you look at it from a practical standpoint," Belgarath said. "The decision to take Urget with us was mine. He'd found out who we are, and I did not want an army of Murgos on our heels. Murgos are not too bright, but they can be an inconvenience at times." Zakath looked surprised.
"He was your prisoner?"
Belgarath shrugged. "In a manner of speaking." The Emperor laughed rather wryly.
"You could have wrung almost any concession from me if you had just delivered him into my hands, you know. Why did you let him go?"
"We didn't need him any more," Garion replied. "We had reached the shores of Lake Thacha, so he really wasn't any kind of threat to us."
Zakath's expression narrowed slightly.
"A few other things happened as well, I think," he observed. Urgot has always been a notorious coward, wholly under the domination of the Grolum Akachak and of his father's generals. But he did not seem very timid while he was extricating his troops from the trap I had laid for them, and all of the reports filtering out of Rak Hagga seem to suggest that he is actually behaving like a king. Did you, by any chance, have anything to do with that?"
"It's possible, I suppose," Geryon answered. "Urgot and I talked a few times, and I told him what he was doing wrong." Zakath tapped one forefinger against his chin, and his eyes were shrewd.
"You may not have made a lion out of him, Belgarian, but at least he is no longer a rabbit."
A chill smile touched the Malloreon's lips.
"In a way, I am rather glad about that. I have never taken much satisfaction in hunting rabbits."
He shaded his eyes with one hand, although the light in the room was not particularly bright.
"But what I cannot understand is how you managed to spirit him out of the Drojum Palace and away from the city. He has whole regiments of bodyguards."
"You're overlooking something, Zakath," Belgarath said to him. "We have certain advantages that are not available to others."
"Sorcery, you mean? Is it really all that reliable?"
"I've had some luck with it from time to time."
Zakath's eyes had become suddenly intent.
"They tell me that you are 5,000 years old, Belgarath. Is that true?"
7, actually. Or a little more. Why do you ask?
"In all of those years, has it not ever occurred to you simply to seize power? You could have made yourself king of the world, you know."
Belgarath looked amused.
"Why would I want to?"
"All men want power. It is human nature."
"Has all your power really made you happy?"
"It has certain satisfactions."
"Enough to make up for all of the petty distractions that go with it."
"I can endure those. At least, I am in a position where no one tells me what to do."
"No one tells me what to do either, and I am not saddled with all of those tedious responsibilities."
Belgarath straightened.
"All right, Zakath. Shall we get to the point? What are your intentions concerning us?"
"I have not really decided that yet."
The Emperor looked around at them.
"I presume that we can all be civilized about the present situation."
"How do you mean, civilized?"
"I will accept your word that none of you will try to escape or do anything rash. I am aware that you and a number of your friends have certain specialized talents. I do not want to be forced to take steps to counteract them."
"We have some rather pressing business," Geryon replied carefully. "So we can only delay for just so long. For the time being, however, I think we can agree to be reasonable about things."
"Good. We'll have to talk later, you and I, and come to know one another. I have had comfortable quarters prepared for you and your friends, and I know that you are anxious about your wife. Now, I hope you will excuse me, but I have some of those tedious responsibilities that Belgarath mentioned to attend to."
Although the house was very large, it was not, strictly speaking, a palace. It appeared that the Murgo governors-general of Hagga, who had ordered it built, had not shared the grandiose delusions which afflicted the rulers of Urga, and so the building was more functional than ornate.
"I hope you will excuse me,"
General Ateska said to them when they had emerged from the audience chamber.
"I am obliged to deliver a full report to His Majesty about various matters. Then I must return immediately to Rakvakat."
He looked at Geryon.
"The circumstances under which we met were not the happiest, Your Majesty," he said. "But I hope you won't think too unkindly of me."
He bowed rather stiffly, then left them in the care of a member of the Emperor's staff. The man who had led them down a long, dark, paneled hallway toward the center of the house was obviously not an Angarak. He had not the angular eyes nor the stiff, bleak-faced arrogance that marked the men of that race. His cheerful, round face seemed to hint at a Melsine heritage, and Geryon remembered that the bureaucracy which controlled most aspects of Malloreon life was made up almost exclusively of Melsines.
"His Majesty asked me to assure you that your quarters are not intended to be a prison,"
the official told them, as they approached a heavily barred iron door blocking off one portion of the hallway.
"This was a Murgle house before we took the city, and it has certain structural peculiarities. Your rooms are in what once were the women's quarters, and Murgles are fanatically protective of their women. It has to do with their concept of racial purity, I think."
At that moment, Geryon had little interest in sleeping arrangements. All of his concern was for Tinedra.
"Do you happen to know where I might find my wife?" he asked the moon-faced bureaucrat.
"There, at the end of this corridor, Your Majesty,"
the Melsine replied, pointing toward a blue-painted door at the far end of the hall.
"Thank you." Geryon glanced at the others. "I'll be back in a little while," he told them, and strode on ahead. The room he entered was warm, and the lighting subdued. Deep, ornately woven Malloreon carpets covered the floor, and soft green velvet drapes covered the tall, narrow windows. Tinedra lay in a high-posted bed against the wall opposite the door, and Polgara was seated at the bedside, her expression grave. "Has there been any change?"
Geryon asked her softly, closing the door behind him.
"Nothing as yet,"
she replied. Tinedra's face was pale as she slept, with her crimson curls tumbled on her pillow.
"She is going to be all right, isn't she?"
Geryon asked.
"Oh, I'm sure of it, Geryon."
Another woman sat near the bed. She wore a light green cowled robe, despite the fact that she was indoors. She had the hood pulled up, partially concealing her face. Tinedra muttered something in a strangely harsh tone and tossed her head restlessly on the pillow. The cowled woman frowned.
"Is this her customary voice, Lady Polgara?"
she asked. Polgara looked at her sharply.
"No," she replied. "As a matter of fact, it is not."
"Would the drug you gave her in some way affect the sound of her speech?"
"No, it wouldn't. Actually, she shouldn't be making any sound at all."
"Ah,"
the woman said.
"I think perhaps I understand now."
She leaned forward and very gently laid the fingertips of one hand on Tinedra's lips. She nodded then and withdrew her hand.
"As I suspected,"
she murmured. Polgara also reached out to touch Tinedra's face. Geryon heard the faint whisper of her will, and the candle at the bedside flared up slightly, then sank back until its flame was scarcely more than a pinpoint.
"Oh, I should have guessed,"
Polgara accused herself.
"What is it?"
Geryon asked in alarm.
"Another mind is seeking to dominate your wife, and to subdue her will, Your Majesty,"
the cowled woman told him.
"It is an art sometimes practiced by the Grolums. They discovered it quite by accident during the Third Age."
"This is Andel, Geryon,"
Polgara told him.
"Sakath sent her here to help care for Tinedra."
Geryon nodded briefly to the hooded woman.
"Exactly what do we mean by the word dominate?" "You should be more familiar with that than most people, Geryon. I am sure you remember Asherak the Murgo."
Geryon felt a sudden chill, remembering the force of the mind that had from his earliest childhood sought that same control over his awareness.
"Drive it out," he pleaded. "Get whomever it is out of her mind."
"Perhaps not quite yet, Geryon," Polgara said coldly.
"We have an opportunity here. Let's not waste it." "I don't understand."
"You will, dear," she told him. Then she rose, sat on the edge of the bed, and lightly laid one hand on each of Tinedra's temples. The faint whisper came again, stronger this time, and once again the candles all flared and then sank back as if suffocating.
"I know you are in there," she said then. "You might as well speak."
Zinedra's expression grew contorted, and she tossed her head back and forth, as if trying to escape the hands touching her temples. Polgara's face grew stern, and she implacably kept her hands in place. The pale lock in her hair began to glow, and a strange chill came into the room, seeming to emanate from the bed itself. Zinedra suddenly screamed. "Speak!" Polgara commanded. "You cannot flee until I release you, and I will not release you until you speak." Zinedra's eyes suddenly opened. They were filled with hate.
"I do not fear thee, Polgara,"
she said in a harsh, rasping voice, delivered in a peculiar accent.
"And I fear you even less. Now, who are you?"
"Thou knowest me, Polgara?"
"Perhaps, but I will have your name from you."
There was a long pause, and the surge of Polgara's will grew even stronger. Zinedra screamed again, a scream filled with agony that made Geryon flinch.
"Stop!"
the harsh voice cried.
"I will speak."
"Say your name," Polgara insisted implacably.
"I am Zandramas."
"So, what do you hope to gain by this?"
An evil chuckle escaped Zinedra's pale lips.
"I have already stolen her heart, Polgara, her child. Now I will steal her mind as well. I could easily kill her if I choose, but a dead queen may be buried, and her grave left behind. A mad one, on the other hand, will give thee much to distract thee from the search for the Tardian."
"I can banish you with a snap of my fingers, Zandramas."
"And I can return just as quickly."
A frosty smile touched Polgara's lips.
"You are not nearly as clever as I thought. Did you actually believe that I twisted your name out of you for my own amusement? Were you ignorant of the power over you that you gave me when you spoke your own name? The power of the name is the most elementary of all. I can keep you out of Zinedra's mind now. There's much more, though. For example, I know now that you are at Ashaba, haunting the bat-infested ruins of the House of Torak like a poor, ragged ghost."
A startled gasp echoed through the room.
"Oh, I could tell you more, Zandramas, but this is all beginning to bore me."
She straightened, her hands still locked to the sides of Zinedra's head. A white lock at her brow flared into incandescence, and the faint whisper became a deafening roar.
"Now, be gone!"
she commanded. Zinedra moaned, and her face suddenly contorted into an expression of agony. An icy, stinking wind seemed to howl through the room, and the candles and glowing braziers sank even lower until the room was scarcely lit.
"Be gone,"
Polgara repeated. An agonized wail escaped Zinedra's lips, and then that wail became disembodied, coming, it seemed, from the empty air above the bed. The candles went out, and all light ceased to glow out of the braziers. The wailing voice began to fade, moving swiftly until it came to them as no more than a murmur echoing from an unimaginable distance.
"Is Zandramas gone?"
Geryon asked in a shaking voice.
"Yes,"
Polgara replied calmly out of the sudden darkness.
"What are we going to say to Zinedra? When she wakes up, I mean." "She won't remember any of this. Just tell her something vague. Make some light, dear."
Geryon fumbled for one of the candles, brushed his sleeve against it, then deftly caught it before it hit the floor. He was sort of proud of that.
"Don't play with it, Geryon, just light it."
Her tone was so familiar and so commonplace that he began to laugh, and the little surge of his will that he directed at the candle was a stuttering sort of thing. The flame that appeared bobbled and hiccuped at the end of the wick in a soundless golden chortle. Polgara looked steadily at the giggling candle, then closed her eyes. "Oh, Geryon," she sighed in resignation. He moved about the room, relighting the other candles and fanning the braziers back into life. The flames were all quite sedate, except for the original one, which continued to dance and laugh in blithe glee. Polgara turned to the hooded Delesian healer. "You are most perceptive, Andel. That sort of thing is difficult to recognize unless you know precisely what you are looking for."
"The perception was not mine, Lady Polgara,"
Andel replied.
"I was advised by another of the cause of Her Majesty's illness."
"Seratus?" Andel nodded.
"The minds of all our race are joined with hers, for we are but the instruments of the task which lies upon her. Her concern for the Queen's well-being prompted her to intervene."
The hooded woman hesitated.
"The Holy Seeress also asked me to beg you to intercede with your husband in the matter of Toth. The goodman's anger is causing that gentle guide extreme anguish, and his pain is also hers. What happened at Verkat had to happen, otherwise the meeting between the Child of Light and the Child of Dark could not come to pass for ages hence."
Polgara nodded gravely.
"I thought it might have been something like that. Tell her that I will speak with Dernick in Toth's behalf."
Andel inclined her head gratefully.
"Geryon?"
Sinedra murmured drowsily.
"Where are we?"
He turned to her quickly. "Are you all right?" he asked, taking her hand in his.
"Mm-hmm,"
she said.
"I'm just so very sleepy. What happened? Where are we?"
"We're at Rak Hagga." He threw a quick glance at Polgara, then turned back to the bed. "You just had a little fainting spell, is all," he said with a slightly exaggerated casualness. "How are you feeling?"
"I'm fine, dear. But I think I'd like to go to sleep now."
And her eyes went closed. Then she opened them again with a sleepy little frown.
"Geryon,"
she murmured.
"why is that candle acting like that?"
He kissed her, lightly on the cheek. "Don't worry about it, dear," he told her. But she had already fallen fast asleep. It was well past midnight when Geryon was awakened by a light tapping on the door of the room in which he slept. "Who is it?" he asked, half rising in his bed.
"A messenger from the Emperor, Your Majesty,"
a voice replied from the other side of the door.
"He instructed me to ask if you would be so good as to join him in his private study."
"Now? In the middle of the night?"
"Such was the Emperor's instructions, Your Majesty."
"All right," Geryon said, throwing off his blankets and swinging around to put his feet on the cold floor. "Give me a minute or so to get dressed."
"Of course, Your Majesty."
Muttering to himself, Geryon began to pull on his clothes by the faint light coming from the brazier in the corner. When he was dressed, he splashed cold water on his face and raked his fingers through his sandy hair, trying to push it into some semblance of order. Almost as an afterthought, he ducked his head and arm through the strap attached to the sheath of Iron-Grip's sword and shrugged it into place across his back. Then he opened the door. "All right," he said to the messenger. "Let's go." Kalzakath's study was a book-lined room with several leather-upholstered chairs, a large polished table, and a crackling fire on the hearth. The Emperor, still clad in plain white linen, sat in a chair at the table, shuffling through a stack of parchment sheets by the light of a single oil lamp. "You wanted to see me, Zakath?" Geryon asked as he entered the room.
"Ah, yes, Belgarian,"
Zakath said, pushing aside the parchments.
"So good of you to come. I understand that your wife is recovering."
Geryon nodded. "Thank you again for sending Andel. Her aid was very helpful."
My pleasure, Belgarian.
Zakath reached out and lowered the wick in the lamp until the corners of the room filled with shadow.
I thought that we might talk a little.
Isn't it sort of late?
I don't sleep very much, Belgarian. A man can lose a third of his life in sleep. The day is filled with bright lights and distractions. The night is dim and quiet, and allows much greater concentration. Please, sit down.
Geryon unbuckled his sword and leaned it against a bookcase.
I am not really all that dangerous, you know,
the Emperor said, looking pointedly at the great weapon. Geryon smiled slightly, settling into a chair by the fire. I didn't bring it because of you, Zakath. It's just a habit. It's not the kind of sword you want to leave lying around.
I don't think that anyone would steal it, Belgarian.
It can't be stolen. I just don't want anybody getting hurt by accidentally touching it.
Do you mean to say that it's that sword?
Geryon nodded. I am sort of obliged to take care of it. It's a nuisance most of the time, but there have been a few occasions when I was glad I had it with me.
What really happened
at Tol Mishrak? Zakath asked suddenly. I have heard all sorts of stories. Geryon nodded wryly. So have I. Most of them get the names right, but not very much else. Neither Torak nor I had very much control over what happened. We fought, and I stuck that sword into his chest.
And he died?
Zakath's face was intent. Eventually, yes.
Eventually?
He vomited fire first and wept flames. Then he cried out.
What did he say?
Mother, Geryon replied shortly. He did not really want to talk about it.
What an extraordinary thing for him to do. What happened to his body? I had the entire ruin of Tol Mishrak searched for him.
The other gods came and took it. Do you suppose we could talk about something else? Those particular memories are painful.
He was your enemy,
Geryon sighed. He was also a god, Zakath, and killing a god is a terrible thing to have to do.
You are a strangely gentle man, Belgarian. I think I respect you more for that than I do for your invincible courage.
I'd hardly say invincible. I was terrified the whole time. So was Torak, I think. Was there something you really wanted to talk about? Zakath leaned back in his chair, tapping thoughtfully at his pursed lips.
You know that eventually you and I will have to confront each other, don't you?
No, Geryon disagreed. That's not absolutely certain.
There can only be one king of the world.
Geryon's look grew pained. I've got enough trouble trying to rule one small island. I've never wanted to be king of the world.
But I have, and do.
Well, then we probably will fight at that, sooner or later. I don't think the world was intended to be ruled by one man. If you try to do that, I will have to stop you.
I am unstoppable, Belgarian.
So was Torak. Or at least he thought so.
Well, that's blunt enough.
It helps to avoid a lot of misunderstandings later on. I'd say that you've got enough trouble at home without trying to invade my kingdom, or those of my friends. That's not to mention the stalemate here in Tol Murgos.
You are well informed.
Queen Poran is a close personal friend. She keeps me advised, and Silk picks up a great deal of information during the course of his business dealings.
Silk?
Excuse me. Prince Keldar, I mean. Silk is a nickname of sorts. Zakath looked at him steadily.
In some ways, we are very much alike, Belgarian, and in other ways very different. But we still do what is necessary, and what necessity compels us to do, Frequently, we are at the mercy of events over which we have no control.
I suppose you are talking about the two prophecies? Zakath laughed shortly.
I don't believe in prophecy. I only believe in power. It is curious, though, that we have both been faced with similar problems of late. You recently had to put down an uprising in Aloria, a group of religious fanatics, I believe. I have something of much the same nature going on in Darshiva. Religion is a constant thorn in the side of any ruler, would you not say?
I've been able to work around it most of the time.
You have been very lucky, then. Torak was neither a good nor kindly god, and his Grolam priesthood is vile. If I were not busy here in Tolmurgos, I think I might endear myself to the next 1,000 or so generations by obliterating every Grolam on the face of the earth.
Geryon grinned at him. What would you say to an alliance with that in mind? Zakath laughed briefly, and then his face grew somber again.
Does the name Zandramas mean anything to you?
Geryon edged around that cautiously, not knowing how much information Zakath had about their real reason for being in Tolmurgos. I've heard some rumors.
How about Thrag Sardius?
I've heard of it.
You are being evasive, Belgarian.
Zakath gave him a steady look, then passed his hand wearily across his eyes. I think you need some sleep, Geryon told him.
Time for that soon enough, when my work is done.
Well, that's up to you, I guess.
How much do you know about Malloreon, Belgarian?
I get reports, a little disjointed sometimes, but fairly current.
No, I mean our past.
Not too much, I'm afraid. Western historians tried very hard to ignore the fact that Malloreon was even there.
Zakath smiled wryly. The University of Malsina has the same short-sightedness regarding the West. Anyway, over the past several centuries, since the disaster at Vomembre, Malloreon society has become almost completely secular. Torak was bound in sleep. Tuchik was practicing his perversions here in Tolmurgos, and Zadar was wandering around the world like a ruthless vagabond. Whatever happened to him, by the way? I thought he was at Tolmishrak.
He was.
We did not find his body.
He's not dead.
He's not?
Zakath looked stunned.
Well, where is he, then?
Beneath the city. Belgarath opened the earth and sealed him up in solid rock under the ruins.
Alive?
Zakath's exclamation came out in a choked gasp. There was a certain amount of justification for it. Go on with your story.
Zakath shuddered and then recovered. With the rest of them out of the way, the only religious figure left in Malloreon was Irvan, and he devoted himself almost exclusively to trying to make his palace at Malyaska more opulent than the imperial one at Malzeth. Every so often he would preach a sermon filled with mumbo-jumbo and nonsense. But most of the time he seemed to have forgotten Torak entirely. With the dragon god and his disciples no longer around, the real power of the Grolam Church was gone. Oh, the priests babbled about the return of Torak, and they all paid lip service to the notion that one day the sleeping god would awaken. But the memory of him grew dimmer and dimmer. The power of the Church grew less and less, while that of the army, which is to say the imperial throne, grew more and more.
Malloreon politics seem to be very murky,
Geryon observed. Zakath nodded. It is part of our nature, I suppose. At any rate, our society was functioning and moving out of the Dark Ages. Slowly, perhaps, but moving. Then you suddenly appeared out of nowhere and awakened Torak, and just as suddenly put him permanently back to sleep again. That's when all of our problems started.
Shouldn't it have ended them? That's sort of what I had in mind.
I don't think you grasp the nature of the religious mind, Bulgarian. So long as Torak was there, even though he slept, the Grolums and the other hysterics in the Empire were fairly placid, secure, even comfortable in their belief that one day he would awaken, punish all of their enemies, and reassert the absolute authority of the unwashed and stinking priesthood. But when you killed Torak, you destroyed their comfortable sense of security. They were forced to face the fact that without Torak, they were nothing. Some of them were so chagrined that they went mad. Others fell into absolute despair. A few, however, began to hammer together a new mythology, something to replace what you had destroyed with a single stroke of that sword over there.
It was not entirely my idea, Geryon told him.
It is the results that matter, Bulgarian, not intentions. Anyway, Irvan was forced to tear himself away from his quest for opulence and his wallowing in the adoration of the sycophants who surrounded him, and get back to business. For a time he was in absolute frenzy of activity. He resurrected all the moth-eaten old prophecies and twisted and wrenched at them, until they seemed to say what he wanted them to say.
And what was that?
He was trying to convince people that a new god will come to rule over Angarak, either a resurrection of Torak himself or some new deity infused with Torak's spirit. He has even got a candidate in mind for this new god of Angarak.
Oh? Who is that?
Zakath's expression became amused. He sees his new god every time he looks in a mirror.
Oh, you're not serious.
Oh, yes. Irvan has been trying to convince himself that he is at least a demigod for several centuries now. He would probably have himself paraded all over Malloria in a golden chariot, except that he is afraid to leave Malyaska. As I understand it, there is a very nasty hunchback who has been hungering to kill him for aeons. One of Aldor's disciples, I believe.
Geryon nodded. Veldin. I've met him.
Is he really as bad as the stories make him out to be?
Oh, probably even worse. I don't think you would want to be around to watch what he does if he ever catches up with Irvan.
I wish him good hunting. But Irvan is not my only problem, I am afraid. Not long after the death of Torak, certain rumors started coming out of Tashiva. A Grolum priestess, Zandramas by name, also began to predict the coming of a new god.
I didn't know that she was a Grolum,
Geryon said with some surprise.
Zakath nodded gravely.
She formerly had a very unsavory reputation at Tashiva. Then the so-called ecstasy of prophecy fell on her, and she was suddenly transformed by it. Now when she speaks, no one can resist her words. She preaches to multitudes and fires them with invincible zeal. Her message of the coming of a new god ran through Tashiva like wildfire and spread into Regal, Versibo, Zamad as well. Virtually the entire northern coast of Malloria is hers.
What does the Sardian have to do with all of this?
I think it is the key to the whole business. Both Zandramas and Irvan seem to believe that whoever finds and possesses it is going to win out.
Agachak, the hierarch of Rak Hagga, believes the same thing, Geryon told him.
Zakath nodded moodily. I suppose I should have realized that. A Grolem is a Grolem, whether he comes from Maloria or Tolmurgos.
It seems to me that maybe you should go back to Maloria and put things in order.
No, Belgarian. I won't abandon my campaign here in Tolmurgos.
Is personal revenge worth it?
Zakath looked startled.
I know why you hated Tar Urgas, but he is dead, and Urgat's not at all like him. I can't really believe that you would sacrifice your whole empire just for the sake of revenging yourself on a man who cannot feel it.
You know?
Zakath's face looked stricken.
Who told you?
Urgat did. He told me the whole story.
With pride, I expect.
Zakath's teeth were clenched and his face pale.
No, not really. It was with regret, and with contempt for Tar Urgas. He hated him even more than you do.
That's hardly possible, Belgarian. To answer your question, yes. I will sacrifice my empire, the whole world if need be, to spill out the last drop of the blood of Tar Urgas. I will neither sleep nor rest, nor be turned aside from my vengeance, and I will crush whomever stands in my path.
Tell him,
the dry voice in Geryon's mind said suddenly.
What? Tell him the truth about Urgat. But do it, Geryon. He needs to know. There are things he has to do, and he won't do them until he puts this obsession behind him.
Zakath was looking at him curiously.
Oh, sorry. Just receiving instructions,
Geryon explained lamely. Instructions? From whom?
You wouldn't believe it. I was told to give you some information.
He drew in a deep breath.
Urgat is not a Murgo, he said flatly.
What are you talking about?
I said that Urgat is not a Murgo. At least, not entirely. His mother was, of course, but his father was not Tar Urgas.
You are lying.
No, I'm not. We found out about it while we were at the Drojum Palace in Rak Hagga. Urgat didn't know about it either.
I don't believe you, Belgarian.
Zakath's face was livid. He was nearly shouting. Tar Urgas is dead, Geryon said wearily. Urgat made sure of it by cutting his throat and burying him head down in his grave. He also claims that he had every one of his brothers, the real sons of Tar Urgas, killed to make himself secure on the throne. I don't think there's one drop of Urga blood left in the world. Zakath's eyes narrowed.
It is a trick. You have allied yourself with Urgat and brought me this absurd lie to save his life.
Use the orb, Geryon, the voice instructed.
How?
Take it off the pommel of the sword. Hold it in your right hand. It will show Zakath the truths that he needs to know.
Geryon rose to his feet.
If I can show you the truth, will you look?
He asked the agitated Malloreon emperor.
Look? Look at what?
Geryon walked over to his sword and peeled off the soft leather sleeve covering the hilt. He put his hand on the orb, and it came free with an audible click. He turned back to the men at the table.
I'm not exactly sure how this works. I'm told that Alder was able to do it, but I've never tried it for myself. I think you're supposed to look into this.
He extended his right arm until the orb was in front of Zakath's face.
What is that?
You people call it Pragyaska, Geryon replied.
Zakath recoiled, his face blanching.
It won't hurt you, as long as you don't touch it.
The orb, which for the past month had rather sullenly obeyed Geryon's continued instructions to restrain itself, slowly began to pulsate and glow in his hand, bathing Zakath's face in its blue radiance.
The Emperor half lifted his hand as if to push the glowing stone aside. "Don't touch it," Geryon warned again. "Just look." But Zakath's eyes were already locked on the stone, its blue light growing stronger and stronger. His hands gripped the edge of the table in front of him so tightly that his knuckles grew white. For a long moment, he stared into that blue incandescence. Then, slowly, his fingers lost their grip on the table edge and fell back onto the arms of his chair. An expression of agony crossed his face.
"They have escaped me," he groaned with tears welling out of his closed eyes. "And I have slaughtered tens of thousands. For nothing."
The tears began to stream down his contorted face. "I'm sorry, Zakath," Geryon said quietly, lowering his hand. "I can't change what has already happened, but you had to know the truth."
"I cannot thank you for this truth,"
Zakath said, his shoulders shaking in the storm of his weeping.
"Leave me, Belgarian. Take that accursed stone from my sight."
Geryon nodded with a great feeling of compassion and shared sorrow. Then he replaced the orb on the pommel of his sword, recovered the hilt, and picked up the great weapon. "I am very sorry, Zakath," he said again. And then he quietly went out of the room, leaving the Emperor of boundless Maloria alone with his grief. Chapter 3.
"Really, Geryon, I'm perfectly fine,"
Sinedra objected again. "I'm glad to hear that."
"Then you will let me get out of bed?"
"No."
"That's not fair,"
she pouted. "Would you like a little more tea?" he asked, going to the fireplace, taking up a poker, and swinging out the iron arm from which a kettle was suspended.
"No, I don't,"
she replied in a sulky little voice.
"It smells, and it tastes awful."
"Aunt Paul says that it's very good for you. Maybe if you drink some more of it, she will let you get out of bed and sit in a chair for a while." He spooned some of the dried aromatic leaves from an earthenware pot into the cup, tipped the kettle carefully with the poker, and filled the cup with steaming water. Sinedra's eyes had momentarily come alight, but narrowed again almost immediately.
"Oh, very clever, Geryon,"
she said in a voice heavy with sarcasm.
"Don't patronize me."
"Of course not," he agreed blandly, setting the cup on the stand beside the bed. "You probably ought to let that steep for a while."
"It can steep all year if it wants to. I'm not going to drink it."
He sighed with resignation. "I'm sorry, Sinedra," he said with genuine regret. "But you are wrong. Aunt Paul says that you are supposed to drink a cup of this every other hour. Until she tells me otherwise, that's exactly what you are going to do."
"What if I refuse?"
Her tone was belligerent. "I am bigger than you are," he reminded her. Her eyes went wide with shock.
"You would not actually force me to drink it, would you?"
His expression grew mournful. "I'd really hate to do something like that," he told her.
"But you would do it, wouldn't you?"
He thought about it a moment and then nodded. Probably, if Aunt Paul told me to." She glared at him.
"All right,"
she said finally.
"Give me the stinking tea."
"Oh, it doesn't smell all that bad, Sinedra."
"Why don't you drink it, then?"
"I'm not the one who has been sick." She proceeded then to tell him, at some length, exactly what she thought of the tea, and him, and her bed, and the room, and of the whole world in general. Many of the terms she used were very colorful, even lurid, and some of them were in languages that he did not recognize. "What on earth is all this shouting about?" Polgara asked, coming into the room.
"I absolutely hate this stuff,"
Sinedra declared, waving the cup about and spilling most of the contents. "I wouldn't drink it, then," Aunt Paul advised calmly.
"Geryon says that if I don't drink it, he will pour it down my throat."
Oh, those were yesterday's instructions. Polgara looked at Geryon. Didn't I tell you that they changed today? No, he replied. As a matter of fact, you didn't. He said it in a very level tone. He was fairly proud of that. I'm sorry, dear. I must have forgotten. When can I get out of bed? Zinedra demanded. Polgara gave her a surprised look. Well, any time you want, dear. As a matter of fact, I just came by to ask if you had planned to join us for breakfast. Zinedra sat up in bed, her eyes like hard little stones. She slowly turned an icy gaze upon Geryon, and then quite deliberately stuck her tongue out at him. Geryon turned to Polgara. Thanks, awfully, he said to her. Oh, don't be snide, dear, she murmured. She looked at the fuming little queen. Zinedra, weren't you told as a child that sticking out one's tongue is the worst possible form of bad manners? Zinedra smiled sweetly. Why, yes, Lady Polgara. As a matter of fact, I was. That's why I only do it on special occasions. I think I'll take a walk, Geryon said to no one in particular. He went to the door, opened it, and left. Some days later, he lounged in one of the sitting rooms that had been built in the former women's quarters where he and the others were lodged. The room was peculiarly feminine. The furniture was softly cushioned and mauve, and the broad windows had filmy curtains of pale lavender. Beyond the windows lay a snowy garden, totally embraced by the tall wings of this bleak Murgo house. A cheery fire was crackling in the half-moon arch of a broad fireplace, and at the far corner of the room an artfully contrived grotto, thick with fern and moss, flourished about a trickling fountain. Geryon sat brooding out at the sunless noon, at an ash-colored sky spitting white pellets that were neither snow nor hail, but something in between, and realized all of a sudden that he was homesick for Riva. It was a peculiar thing to come to grips with here on the opposite end of the world. Always before, the word homesick had been associated with Faldor's farm, the kitchen, the broad central courtyard, Dernick's smithy, and all the other dear, treasured memories. Now, suddenly, he missed that storm-lashed coast, the security of that grim fortress hovering above the bleak city lying below, and the mountains heavy with snow, rising stark white against a black and stormy sky. There was a faint knock at the door. Yes, Geryon said absently, not looking around. The door opened almost timidly. Your Majesty, a vaguely familiar voice said. Geryon turned, looking back over his shoulder. The man was chubby and bald, and he wore a brown, plain, serviceable color, though his robe was obviously costly, and the heavy gold chain about his neck loudly proclaimed that this was no minor official. Geryon frowned slightly. Haven't we met before? Aren't you General Ateska's friend, Bredor, Your Majesty? The brown-robed man supplied. Chief of the Bureau of Internal Affairs. Oh, yes, now I remember. Come in, Your Excellency, come in. Thank you, Your Majesty. Bredor came into the room and moved toward the fireplace, extending his hands to its warmth. Miserable climate, he shuddered. You should try a winter in Riva, Geryon said, although it's summer there right now. Bredor looked out the window at the snowy garden. Strange place, Tolmurgos. One's tempted to believe that all of Mogodom is deliberately ugly, and then one comes across a room like this. I suspect that the ugliness was to satisfy Tuchik and Taur Urgas, Geryon replied. Underneath, Murgos probably aren't much different from the rest of us. Bredor laughed. That sort of thinking is considered heresy in Malzeth, he said. The people in Val Alorn feel much the same way. Geryon looked at the bureaucrat. I expect that this is not just a social call, Bredor. What's on your mind?
Your Majesty, Brador said soberly, I absolutely have to speak with the Emperor. Otesko tried to arrange it before he went back to Rak Hagga, but... He spread his hands helplessly. Could you possibly speak to him about it? The matter is of the utmost urgency.
I really don't think there's very much I can do for you, Brador. Right now, I'm probably the last person he'd want to talk to.
Oh?
I told him something that he did not want to hear.
Brador's shoulders slumped in defeat. You were my last hope, Your Majesty.
Well, what's the problem?
Brador hesitated, looking around nervously as if to assure himself that they were indeed alone. Malloreon, he said in a very quiet voice, have you ever seen a demon?
A couple of times, yes. It's not the sort of experience I'd care to repeat.
How much do you know about the Karands?
Not a great deal. I've heard that they are related to the Morindum in North Garagnadrak.
You know more about them than most people, then. Do you know very much about the religious practices of the Morindum?
Geryon nodded. They are demon worshippers. It's not a particularly safe form of religion, I've noticed.
Brador's face was bleak. The Karanda share the beliefs and practices of their cousins on the Arctic plains of the West. After they were converted to the worship of Torak, the Grolums tried to stamp out those practices, but they persisted in the mountains and forests.
He stopped and looked fearfully around again.
Malloreon, he said, almost in a whisper. Does the name Menga mean anything to you?
No, I don't think so. Who is Menga?
We don't know, at least not for certain. He seems to have come out of the forest to the north of Lake Karanda about 6 months ago.
And?
He marched, alone, to the gates of Kalida and Jino, and called for the surrender of the city. Oh, they laughed at him, of course, but then he marked some symbols on the ground. They did not laugh any more after that.
The Malcene bureaucrat's face was gray.
Malloreon, he unloosed a horror on Kalida, such as a man has never seen before. Those symbols he drew on the ground summoned up a host of demons, not one or a dozen, but a whole army of them. I've talked with survivors of that attack. They are mostly mad, mercifully so, I think, and what happened at Kalida was utterly unspeakable.
An army of them?
Geryon exclaimed. Brador nodded. That's what makes Menga so dreadfully dangerous. As I'm sure you know, usually, when someone summons a demon, sooner or later it gets away from him and kills him. But Menga appears to have absolute control of all of the fiends that he raises, and he can call them up by the hundreds. Urvan is terrified, and he has even begun to experiment with magic himself, hoping to defend Mariaska against Menga. We don't know where Zandromos is, but her apostate Grolum cohorts are desperately striving also to summon up these fiends. Great God, Geryon, help me! This unholy infection will spread out of Malloreon and sweep the world. We will all be engulfed by howling fiends, and no place, no matter how remote, will provide a haven for the pitiful remnants of mankind. Help me to persuade Kal Zakath that his petty little war here in Tolmurgos has no real meaning in the face of the horror that is emerging in Malloreon.
Geryon gave him a long, steady look. Then he rose to his feet. You had better come with me, Brador, he said quietly. I think we need to talk with Belgarath. They found the old sorcerer in the book-lined library of the house, poring over an ancient volume bound in green leather. He set his book aside and listened as Brador repeated what he had told Geryon.
Ervan and Xandromos are also engaging in this insanity?" he asked, when the Melcene had finished. Brador nodded. "According to our best information, Ancient One," he replied. Belgarath slammed his fist down and began to swear. "What are they thinking of?" he burst out, pacing up and down. "Don't they know that Ul himself had forbidden this?" "They're afraid of Minga," Brador said helplessly. "They feel that they must have some way to protect themselves from this horde of fiends." "You do not protect yourself from demons by raising more of them," the old man fumed. "If even one of them breaks free, they all get loose. Ervan or Xandromos might be able to handle them. But sooner or later some underling is going to make a mistake. Now let's go see Zakath."
"I don't think we can get in to see him just now, Grandfather," Geryon said dubiously. "He didn't like what I told him about Urget."
"That's too bad. This is something that will not wait for him to regain his composure. Let's go."
The three of them went quickly through the corridors of the house to the large antechamber they had entered with General Ateska upon their arrival from Rak Hagga.
"Absolutely impossible,"
the colonel at the desk beside the main door declared when Belgarath demanded to see the Emperor immediately.
"As you grow older, Colonel," the old man said ominously, "you will discover just how meaningless the word impossible really is."
He raised one hand, gestured somewhat theatrically, and Geryon heard and felt the surge of his will. A number of battle flags mounted on stout poles projected out from the opposite wall, perhaps 15 feet from the floor. The officious colonel vanished from his chair and reappeared precariously astride one of those poles, with his eyes bulging and his hands desperately clinging to his slippery perch.
"Where would you like to go next, Colonel?" Belgarath asked him. "As I recall, there is a very tall flagpole out front. I could set you on top of it if you wish."
The colonel stared at him in horror.
"Now, as soon as I bring you down from there, you are going to persuade your Emperor to see us at once. You are going to be very convincing, Colonel. That's unless you want to be a permanent flagpole ornament, of course."
The colonel's face was still pasty white when he emerged from the guarded door leading to the audience chamber, and he flinched violently every time Belgarath moved his hand.
"His Majesty consents to see you," he stammered.
Belgarath grunted.
"I was almost sure that he would."
Kal Zakath had undergone a noticeable transformation since Geryon had last seen him. His white linen robe was wrinkled and stained. There were dark circles under his eyes. His face was deathly pale, his hair unkempt, and he was unshaven. Spasm-like tremors ran through his body, and he looked almost too weak to stand.
"What do you want?"
he demanded in a barely audible voice.
"Are you sick?" Belgarath asked him.
"A touch of fever, I think,"
Zakath shrugged.
"What is so important that you felt you had to force your way in here to tell me about it?"
"Your empire is collapsing, Zakath," Belgarath told him flatly. "It's time you went home to mend your fences."
Zakath smiled faintly.
"Wouldn't that be so very convenient for you?"
"What is going on in Malloreon is not convenient for anybody. Tell him, Brador."
Nervously, the Melcene bureaucrat delivered his report.
"Demons,"
Zakath retorted skeptically.
"Come now, Belgarath. Surely you don't expect me to believe that, do you? Do you honestly think that I will run back to Malloreon to chase shadows and leave you behind to raise an army here in the west to confront me when I return?"
The palsy-like shaking Geryon had noted when they had entered the room seemed to be growing more severe. Zakath's head bobbed and jerked on his neck, and a stream of spittle ran unnoticed from one corner of his mouth.
You won't be leaving us behind, Zakath. We are going with you. If even a tenth of what Brador says is true, I'm going to have to go to Karanda and stop this Menga. If he is raising demons, we are all going to have to put everything else aside to stop him. Absurd, Zakath declared agitatedly. His eyes were unfocused now, and his weaving and trembling had become so severe that he was unable to control his limbs. I'm not going to be tricked by a clever old man into... He suddenly started up from his chair with an animal-like cry, clutching at the sides of his head. Then he toppled forward to the floor, twitching and jerking. Belgarath jumped forward and took hold of the convulsing man's arms. "Quick!" he snapped. "Get something between his teeth before he bites off his tongue." Brador grabbed up a sheaf of reports from a nearby table, wadded them up and jammed them into the frothing Emperor's mouth. "Geryon," Belgarath barked. "Get Paul. Fast!" Geryon started toward the door at a run. "Wait," Belgarath said, sniffing suspiciously at the air above the face of the man he was holding down. "Bring Sadi, too. There is a peculiar smell here. Hurry!" Geryon bolted. He ran through the hallways past startled officials and servants, and finally burst into the room where Polgara was quietly talking with Tsenedra and Velvet.
"Aunt Paul,"
he shouted.
"Come quickly. Zakath just collapsed."
Then he spun, ran a few more steps down the hall, and shouldered open the door to Tzadi's room.
"We need you,"
he barked at the startled eunuch.
"Come with me."
It took only a few moments for the three of them to return to the polished door in the anteroom.
"What's going on?"
the Angarak colonel demanded in a frightened voice, barring their way.
"Your emperor is sick," Geryon told him. "Get out of the way."
Roughly, he pushed the protesting officer to one side and yanked the door open. Zakath's convulsions had at least partially subsided, but Belgarath still held him down.
"What is it, father?"
Polgara asked, kneeling beside the stricken man. "He threw a fit."
"The falling sickness?"
"I don't think so. Wasn't quite the same. Tzadi, come over here, smell his breath. I'm getting a peculiar odor from him."
Tzadi approached cautiously, leaned forward, and sniffed several times. Then he straightened, his face pale.
"Talat," he announced.
"A poison?"
Polgara asked him.
Tzadi nodded.
"It is quite rare."
"Do you have the antidote?"
"No, my lady," he replied. "There is not an antidote for Talat. It has always been universally fatal. It's seldom used because it acts very slowly, but no one ever recovers from it."
"Then he's dying?"
Geryon asked with a sick feeling. "In a manner of speaking, yes. The convulsions will subside, but they will reoccur with increasing frequency. Finally," Tzadi shrugged.
"There is no hope at all?"
"None whatsoever, my lady. About all we can do is make his last few days more comfortable." Belgarath started to swear. "Oh, quiet him down, Paul. We need to get him into bed. We can't move him while he is jerking around that way."
She nodded and put one hand on Zakath's forehead. Geryon felt the faint surge, and the struggling emperor grew quiet. Brador, his face very pale, looked at them.
"I don't think we should announce this just yet," he cautioned. "Let's just call it a slight illness for the moment. Until we can decide what to do, I will send for a litter."
The room to which the unconscious Zakath was taken was plain to the point of severity. The emperor's bed was a narrow cot. The only other furniture was a single plain chair and a low chest. The walls were white and unadorned, and a charcoal brazier glowed in one corner. Tzadi went back to their chambers and returned with his red case and the canvas sack in which Polgara kept her collection of herbs and remedies.
The two of them consulted in low tones while Geryon and Bredor pushed the litter-bearers and curious soldiers from the room. Then they mixed a steaming cup of a pungent-smelling liquid. Tzadi raised Zakath's head and held it, while Polgara spooned the medicine into his slack-lipped mouth. The door opened quietly, and the green-robed Dalesian healer, Andal, entered.
"I came as soon as I heard," she said. "Is the Emperor's illness serious?"
Polgara looked at her gravely. "Close the door, Andal," she said quietly. The healer gave her a strange look, then pushed the door shut.
"Is it that grave, my lady?"
Polgara nodded.
"He has been poisoned. We don't want word of it to get out just yet."
Andal gasped.
"What can I do to help?"
she asked, coming quickly to the bed. "Not very much, I am afraid," Tzadi told her.
"Have you given him the antidote yet?"
"There is no antidote."
"There must be, Lady Polgara."
Polgara sadly shook her head.
"I have failed, then,"
the hooded woman said in a voice filled with tears. She turned from the bed, her head bowed, and Geryon heard a faint murmur that somehow seemed to come from the air above her, a murmur that, curiously, was not that of a single voice. There was a long silence, then a shimmering appeared at the foot of the bed. When it cleared, the blindfolded form of Tsaradis stood there, one hand slightly extended.
"This must not be,"
she said in her clear, ringing voice.
"Use thine art, Lady Polgara. Restore him. Should he die, all our tasks will fail. Bring thy power to bear."
"It won't work, Tsaradis,"
Polgara replied, setting the cup down.
"If a poison affects only the blood, I can usually manage to purge it, and Sadi has a whole case full of antidotes. This poison, however, sinks into every particle of the body. It is killing his bones, his organs, even his blood, and there is no way to leach it out."
The shimmering form at the foot of the bed wrung its hands in anguish.
"It cannot be so,"
Tsaradis wailed.
"Hast thou even applied the sovereign specific?"
Polgara looked up quickly.
"Sovereign specific? A universal remedy? I know of no such agent."
"But it doth exist, Lady Polgara. I know not its origins nor its composition, but I have felt its gentle power abroad in the world for some years now."
Polgara looked at Andal, but the healer shook her head helplessly.
"I do not know of such a potion, my lady."
"Think, Tsaradis," Polgara said urgently. "Anything you can tell us might give us a clue."
The blindfolded seeress touched the fingertips of one hand lightly to her temple.
"Its origins are recent,"
she said, half to herself.
"It came into being less than a score of years ago, some obscure flower, or so it seemeth to me."
"It's hopeless, then," Tzadi said. "There are millions of kinds of flowers."
He rose and crossed the room to Belgarath.
"I think we might want to leave here almost immediately," he murmured. "At the first suggestion of the word poison, people start looking for the nearest Naisen, and those associated with him. I think we are in a great deal of danger right now."
"Can you think of anything else, Tsaradis? No matter how remote?"
Polgara pressed. The seeress struggled with it. Her face strained as she reached deeper into her strange vision. Her shoulders finally sagged in defeat.
"Nothing. Only a woman's face."
"Describe it."
"She is tall,"
the seeress replied.
"Her hair is very dark, but her skin is like marble. Her husband is much involved with horses."
"Adara!" Geryon exclaimed, the beautiful face of his cousin suddenly coming before his eyes. Polgara snapped her fingers.
"And Adara's rose."
Then she frowned.
I examined that flower very closely some years back, Sir Addis. Are you absolutely sure? There are some unusual substances in it. I didn't find any particular medicinal qualities in any of them, either in any distillation or powder.
Sir Addis concentrated.
Can healing be accomplished by means of a fragrance, Lady Polgara?
Polgara's eyes narrowed in thought.
There are some minor remedies that are inhaled,
she said doubtfully.
But there are poisons that can be administered in that fashion, Lady Polgara,
Tzadi supplied.
The fumes are drawn into the lungs, and from there into the heart. Then the blood carries them to every part of the body. It could very well be the only way to neutralize the effects of Talit.
Belgarath's expression had grown intent. Well, Paul?
Oh, it's worth a try, Father. I've got a few of the flowers. They are dried, but they might work.
Any seeds?
A few, yes.
Seeds?
Andel exclaimed.
Kazakath would be months in his grave before any bush can grow and bloom.
The old man chuckled slyly. Not quite. He winked at Polgara. I have quite a way with plants sometimes. I'm going to need some dirt, some boxes or tubs to put it in.
Tzadi went to the door and spoke briefly with the guards outside. They looked baffled, but a short command from Andal sent them scurrying.
What is the origin of this strange flower, Lady Polgara?
Sir Addis asked curiously.
How is it that thou art so well acquainted with it?
Geryon made it,
Polgara shrugged, looking thoughtfully at Zakath's narrow cot.
I think we will want the bed out from the wall, Father. I want it surrounded by flowers.
Made?
The Tzires exclaimed. Polgara nodded.
Created, actually,
she said absently.
Do you think it's warm enough in here, Father? We are going to want big, healthy blooms, and even at the best, the flowers a bit puny. Well, I did my best,
Geryon protested.
Created?
Sir Addis's voice was awed. Then she bowed to Geryon with profound respect.
When the tubs of half-frozen dirt had been placed about the stricken emperor's bed, smoothed and dampened with water, Polgara took a small leather pouch from her green canvas sack, removed a pinch of minuscule seeds, and carefully sowed them in the soil.
All right, Belgarath said, rolling up his sleeves in a workmanlike fashion. Stand back. He bent and touched the dirt in one of the tubs. You were right, Paul. Just a little too cold. He frowned slightly, and Geryon saw his lips move. The surge was not a large one, and the sound of it was little more than a whisper. The damp earth in the tubs began to steam. No, that's better, he said. Then he extended his hands out over the narrow cot and the steaming tubs. Again, Geryon felt the surge and the whisper. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But then, tiny specks of green appeared on the top of the dampened dirt. Even as Geryon watched those little leaves grow and expand, he remembered where he had seen Belgarath perform this same feat before. As clearly as if he were there, he saw the courtyard before King Coradulan's palace at Vomimbre, and he saw the apple twig the old man had thrust down between the two flagstones, expanding and reaching up toward the old sorcerer's hand, as proof to the skeptical Sir Andorig that he was indeed who he said he was. The pale green leaves had grown darker, and the spindly twigs and tendrils that had first appeared had already expanded into low bushes. "Make them vine up across the bed, Father," Polgara said critically. "Vines produce more blossoms, and I want a lot of blossoms." He let out his breath explosively and gave her a look that spoke volumes. "All right, you want vines? Vines it is." "Is it too much for you, Father?" she asked, solicitously. He set his jaw, but did not answer. He did, however, begin to sweat.
Longer tendrils began to writhe upward like green snakes winding up around the legs of the Emperor's cot, reaching upward to catch the bed frame. Once they had gained that foothold, they seemed to pause, while Belgarath caught his breath.
This is harder than it looks,
he puffed. Then he concentrated again, and the vines quickly overspread the cot, and Kal Zakath's inert body, until only his ashen face remained uncovered by them.
"All right," Belgarath said to the plants. "That's far enough. You can bloom now."
There was another surge and a peculiar ringing sound. The tips of all the myriad twiglets swelled, and then those buds began to split, revealing their pale lavender interiors. Almost shyly, the lopsided little flowers opened, filling the room with a gentle-seeming fragrance. Geryon straightened as he breathed in that delicate odor. For some reason, he suddenly felt very good, and the cares and worries which had beset him for the past several months seemed to fall away. The slack-faced Zakath stirred slightly, took a breath, sighed deeply. Polgara laid her fingertips to the side of his neck. "I think it's working, Father. His heart is not laboring so hard now, and his breathing seems easier."
"Good," Belgarath replied. "I would hate to go through something like that for nothing."
Then the Emperor opened his eyes. The shimmering form of Saradis hovered anxiously at the foot of his bed. Strangely, he smiled when he saw her, and her shy, answering smile lighted her pale face. Then Zakath sighed once more and closed his eyes again. Geryon leaned forward to make sure that the sick man was still breathing. When he looked back toward the foot of the bed, the seeress of Kel was gone. Chapter 4. A warm wind came in off the lake that night, and the wet snow that had blanketed Rak Hagga and the surrounding countryside turned to a dreary slush that sagged and fell from the limbs of the trees in the little garden at the center of the house, sliding in sodden clumps from the gray slate roof. Geryon and Silk sat near the fire in the mauve-cushioned room, looking out at the garden and talking quietly.
"We'd know a great deal more if I could get in touch with Yarblek," Silk was saying. The little man was dressed again in that pearl-gray doublet and black hose which he had favored during those years before they had begun this search, although he wore only a few costly rings and ornaments, which had made him appear so ostentatiously wealthy at that time.
"Isn't he in Garog-Nadrak?" Geryon asked. Geryon had also discarded his serviceable travel clothing and reverted to his customary silver-trimmed blue.
"It's hard to say exactly where Yarblek is at any given time, Geryon. He moves around a great deal, but no matter where he goes, the reports from our people in Malzerth, Mersin, and Magaren are all forwarded to him. Whatever this Menga is up to is almost certain to have disrupted trade. I'm sure that our agents have gathered everything they can find out about him and sent it along to Yarblek. Right now, my scruffy-looking partner probably knows more about Menga than Brador's secret police do."
"I don't want to get sidetracked, Silk. Our business is with Xandramas, not Menga."
"Oh, demons are everybody's business," Silk replied soberly. "But no matter what we decide to do, we have to get to Malloreon first, and that means persuading Zakath that this is serious. Was he listening at all when you told him about Menga?"
Geryon shook his head. "I'm not sure if he even understood what we were telling him. He was not altogether rational."
Silk grunted. "When he wakes up, we'll have to try again."
A sly grin crossed the little man's face. "I have had a certain amount of luck negotiating with sick people," he said. "Isn't that sort of contemptible?"
"Of course it is, but it gets results."
Later that morning, Geryon and his rat-faced friend stopped by the Emperor's room, ostensibly to inquire about his health. Polgara and Sadi were seated on either side of the bed, and Andal sat quietly in the corner. The vines that had enveloped the narrow cot had been pulled aside, but the air in the room was still heavy with the fragrance of the small lavender flowers. The sick man was propped into a half-sitting position by pillows, but his eyes were closed as Silk and Geryon entered. His cat lay contentedly purring at the foot of the bed.
"How is he?"
Geryon asked quietly.
"He has been awake a few times," Sadi replied. "There are still some traces of talat in his extremities, but they seem to be dissipating."
The eunuch was picking curiously at one of the small flowers.
"I wonder if these would work if they were distilled down to an essence," he mused. "Or perhaps an attar. It might be very interesting to wear a perfume that could ward off any poison."
He frowned slightly.
"And I wonder if they would be effective against snake venom."
"Why don't you have Zith bite someone?" Silk suggested. "Then you can test it."
"Would you like to volunteer, Prince Keldar?"
"No, Sadi," Silk declined. "Thanks all the same." He looked at the red case lying open on the floor in the corner. "Is she confined, by the way?" he asked nervously.
"She is sleeping," Sadi replied. "She always takes a little nap after breakfast."
Geryon looked at the dozing Emperor.
"Is he coherent at all? When he's awake, I mean." "His mind seems to be clearing,"
Polgara told him.
"Hysteria and delirium are some of the symptoms brought on by talat," Sadi said. "Growing rationality is an almost certain sign of recovery."
"Is that you, Belgarian?"
Zakath asked, almost in a whisper and without opening his eyes.
"Yes,"
Geryon replied.
"How are you feeling?"
"Weak. Light-headed. Every muscle in my body screams like an abscessed tooth. Aside from that, I'm fine."
He opened his eyes with a wry smile.
"What happened? I seem to have lost track of things."
Geryon glanced briefly at Polgara, and she nodded.
"You were poisoned,"
he told the sick man. Zakath looked a bit surprised.
"It must not have been a very good one, then."
"Actually, it's one of the very best, Your Imperial Majesty."
Sadi disagreed mildly.
"It has always been universally lethal."
"I am dying, then?"
Zakath said it with a peculiar kind of satisfaction, almost as if he welcomed the idea.
"Ah, well," he sighed. "That should solve many problems."
"Oh, I'm very sorry, Your Majesty," Silk said with mock regret. "But I think you'll live. Belgarath tampers with the normal course of events from time to time. It is a bad habit he picked up in his youth, but a man needs some vices, I suppose."
Zakath smiled weakly.
"You are a droll little fellow, Prince Keldar."
"If you're really keen on dying, though," Silk added outrageously, "we could always wake Zith. One nip from her almost guarantees perpetual slumber."
"Zith?"
"Sadi's pet. A little green snake. She could even curl up at your ear after she bites you and purr you into eternity."
Zakath sighed, and his eyes drooped shut again.
"I think we should let him sleep,"
Polgara said quietly.
"Not just yet, Lady Polgara,"
the Emperor said.
I have shunned sleep and the dreams which infest it for so long, that it comes unnaturally now.
You must sleep, Khal Zakath,
Andal told him.
There are ways to banish evil dreams, and sleep is the greatest healer.
Zakath sighed and shook his head.
I am afraid you won't be able to banish these dreams, Andal.
And then he frowned slightly.
Tzadi, is hallucination one of the symptoms of the poison I was given?
It's possible, the eunuch admitted. What horrors have you seen?
Not a horror, Zakath replied. I seem to see the face of a young woman. Her eyes are bound with a strip of cloth. A peculiar peace comes over me when I see her face.
That was not an hallucination, Khal Zakath,
Andal told him.
Who is this strange blind child, then?
My mistress,
Andal said proudly.
The face which came to you in your direst hour was the face of Teradus, the seeress of Kel, upon whose decision rests the fate of all the world, and of all other worlds as well.
So great a responsibility to lie upon such slender shoulders, Zakath said.
It is her task,
Andal said simply. The sick man seemed to fall again into a doze, his lips lightly touched with a peculiar smile. Then his eyes opened again, seemingly more alert now.
Am I healed, Tzadi?
He asked the shaven-headed eunuch.
Has your excellent Naisan poison quite run its course?
Oh, Tzadi replied speculatively. I wouldn't say that you're entirely well yet, your majesty, but I would guess that you are out of any immediate danger.
Good,
Zakath said crisply, trying to shoulder his way up into a sitting position. Geryon reached out to help him.
And has the knave who poisoned me been apprehended yet?
Tzadi shook his head. Not as far as I know, he answered.
I think that might be the first order of business, then. I am starting to feel a little hungry, and I would rather not go through this again. Is the poison common in Tul Murgos?
Tzadi frowned. Murgo law forbids poisons and drugs, your majesty. They are a backward sort of people. The Dagashi assassins probably have access to Tarat, though.
You think my poisoner might have been a Dagashi, then?
Tzadi shrugged. Most assassinations in Tol Murgos are carried out by the Dagashi. They are efficient and discreet. Zakath's eyes narrowed in thought.
That would seem to point a finger directly at Urgot, then. The Dagashi are expensive, and Urgot has access to the royal treasury.
Silk grimaced.
No,
he declared. Urgot would not do that. A knife between your shoulder blades, maybe, but not a poison.
How can you be so sure, Keldar?
I know him, Silk replied a bit lamely. He's weak and a little timid, but he would not be a party to a poisoning. It is a contemptible way to resolve political differences. Prince Keldar, Tzadi protested. Oh, except in Naisa, of course, Silk conceded. One always needs to take quaint local customs into account. He pulled at his long, pointed nose. I'll admit that Urgot would not grieve too much if you woke up dead some morning, he said to the Malloreon Emperor. But it is all just a little too pat. If your generals believed that it was Urgot who had arranged to have you killed, they would stay here for the next 10 generations, trying to obliterate all of Murgodom, wouldn't they?
I would assume so, Sakath said.
Who would benefit the most by disposing of you, and rather effectively making sure that the bulk of your army does not return to Malloria in the foreseeable future? Not Urgot, certainly. More likely it would be somebody in Malloria who wants a free hand there. Silk squared his shoulders. Why don't you let Lyselle and I do a little snooping around before you lock your mind in stone on this? Obvious things always make me suspicious.
That is all very well, Keldar, Sakath said rather testily. But how can I be sure that my next meal won't have another dose of exotic spices in it?
You have at your bedside the finest cook in the world, the rat-faced man said, pointing grandly at Polgara. And I can absolutely guarantee that she won't poison you. Oh, she might turn you into a radish if you offend her, but she'd never poison you. All right, Silk, that will do, Polgara told him. I'm only paying tribute to your extraordinary gifts, Polgara. Her eyes grew hard. I think that perhaps it might be time for me to be on my way, Silk said to Geryon. Wise decision, Geryon murmured. The little man turned and quickly left the room.
Is he really as good as he pretends to be?
Sakath asked curiously. Polgara nodded. Between them, Keldar and Lyselle can probably ferret out any secret in the world. Silk doesn't always like it, but they are almost a perfect team. And now, Your Majesty, what would you like for breakfast? A curious exchange was taking place in the corner. Throughout the previous conversation, Geryon had heard a faint, drowsy purr coming from Zith's earthenware bottle. Either the little snake was expressing a general sense of contentment, or it may have been one of the peculiarities of her species to purr while sleeping. Sakath's pregnant, mackerel-striped cat, attracted by that sound, jumped down from the bed and curiously waddled toward Zith's little home. Absently, probably without even thinking about it, she responded to the purr coming from the bottle with one of her own. She sniffed at the bottle, then tentatively touched it with one soft paw. The peculiar duet of purring continued. Then, perhaps because Tzadi had not stoppered the bottle tightly enough, or because she had long since devised this simple means of opening her front door, the little snake nudged the cork out of the bottle with her blunt nose. Both creatures continued to purr, although the cat was now obviously afire with curiosity. For a time, Zith did not reveal herself, but lurked shyly in her bottle, still purring. Then, cautiously, she poked out her head, her forked tongue flickering as she tested the air. The cat jumped straight up to a height of about 3 feet, giving vent to a startled yowl. Zith retreated immediately back into the safety of her house, though she continued to purr. Warily, but still burning with curiosity, the cat approached the bottle again, moving 1 foot at a time.
Tzadi,
Sakath said, his voice filled with concern.
There is no immediate danger, Your Majesty, the eunuch assured him. Zith never bites while she is purring.
Again, the little green snake slid her head out of the bottle. This time, the cat recoiled only slightly. Then, curiosity overcoming her natural aversion to reptiles, she continued her slow advance, her nose reaching out toward this remarkable creature. Zith, still purring, also extended her blunt nose. Their noses touched, and both flinched back slightly. Then they cautiously sniffed at each other, the cat with her nose, the snake with her tongue, Both were purring loudly now. "Astonishing," Tzadi murmured. "I think they actually like each other."
"Tzadi, please," Zakath said plaintively. "I don't know how you feel about your snake, but I am rather fond of my cat, and she is about to become a mother."
"I'll speak with them, Your Majesty," Tzadi assured him. "I am not sure that they will listen, but I will definitely speak with them." Belgarath had once again retired to the library, and Geryon found him later that day poring over a large map of northern Maloria.
"Oh,"
he said, looking up as Geryon entered. "There you are. I was just about to send for you. Come over here and look at this." Geryon went to the table. "The appearance of this Minga fellow might just work to our advantage, you know."
"I don't quite follow that, Grandfather."
"Zandramas is here, at Ashaba, right?" Belgarath stabbed his finger at a spot in the representation of the Karandese mountains.
"Yes,"
Geryon said. "And Minga is moving west and south out of Khalida, over here." The old man poked at the map again.
"That's what Brydor says."
"He has got her blocked off from most of the continent. She's been very careful here in Tolmurgos, Geryon, to avoid the populated areas. There is no reason to believe that she is going to change once she gets to Maloria. Irvan is going to be to the south of her at Malyaska, and the wastes to the north are virtually impassable, even though it is nearly summer."
"Summer?"
"In the northern half of the world it is."
"Oh, yes, I keep forgetting."
Geryon peered at the map.
"Grandfather, we don't have any idea of where the place which is no more might be. When Zandramas leaves Ashaba, she could go in any direction."
Belgarath squinted at the map. "I don't think so, Geryon. In the light of all that has happened in Maloria, coupled with the fact that by now she knows that we are on her trail, I think she almost has to be trying to get back to her power base in Barshiva. Everybody in the world is after her. She needs help."
"We certainly aren't threatening her all that much," Geryon said moodily. "We can't even get out of Tolmurgos."
"That's what I wanted to talk to you about. You have got to persuade Zakath that it is vital for us to leave here, and to get to Maloria as quickly as possible."
"Persuade?"
"Just do whatever you have to, Geryon. There is a great deal at stake."
"Why me?"
Geryon said it without thinking. Belgarath gave him a long, steady look.
"Sorry,"
Geryon muttered.
"Forget that I said it."
"All right. I'll do that."
Late that evening, Zakath's cat gave birth to 7 healthy kittens, while Zith hovered in anxious attendance, warning off all other observers with ominous hisses. Peculiarly, the only person the protective little reptile would allow near the newborn kittens was Velvet. Geryon had little success during the next couple of days in his efforts to steer his conversations with the convalescing Zakath around to the subject of the necessity for returning to Maloria. The Emperor usually pleaded a lingering weakness as a result of his poisoning, though Geryon privately suspected subterfuge on that score, since the man appeared to have more than enough energy for his usual activities and only protested exhaustion when Geryon wanted to talk about a voyage. On the evening of the 4th day, however, he decided to try negotiation one last time before turning to more direct alternatives. He found Zakath seated in the chair near his bed with a book in his hands. The dark circles beneath his eyes had vanished, the trembling had disappeared entirely, and he seemed totally alert.
"Ah, Belgarian," he said almost cheerfully. "So good of you to stop by."
"I thought I'd come in and put you to sleep again,"
Geryon replied with a slightly exaggerated sarcasm.
Have I been that obvious?
Zakath asked. Yes, as a matter of fact, you have. Every time I mention the words ship and Malloria in the same sentence, your eyes snap shut, Zakath. We have got to talk about this, and time is starting to run out. Zakath passed one hand across his eyes with some show of weariness. Let me put it this way, Geryon pressed on. Belgarath is starting to get impatient. I am trying to keep our discussions civil, but if he steps in, I can almost guarantee that they are going to turn unpleasant very quickly. Zakath lowered his hand and his eyes narrowed.
That sounds vaguely like a threat, Belgarian.
No, Geryon disagreed. As a matter of fact, it's in the nature of friendly advice. If you want to stay here in Tol Murgos, that's up to you. But we have to get to Malloria, and soon.
And if I choose not to permit you to go?
Permit? Geryon laughed. Zakath, did you grow up in the same world with the rest of us? Have you got even the remotest idea of what you are talking about?
I think that concludes this interview, Belgarian,
the Emperor said coldly. He rose stiffly to his feet and turned to his bed. As usual, his cat had deposited her mewling little brood in the center of his coverlet, then gone off to nap alone in her wool-lined box in the corner. The irritated Emperor looked with some exasperation at the furry little puddle on his bed.
You have my permission to withdraw, Belgarian,
he said over his shoulder. Then he reached down with both hands to scoop up the cluster of kittens. Zith reared up out of the very center of the furry heap, fixed him with a cold eye, and hissed warningly.
Thorax teeth,
Zakath swore, jerking his hands away.
This is going too far. Go tell Sadi that I want his accursed snake out of my room immediately.
He has taken her out 4 times already, Zakath, Geryon said mildly. She just keeps crawling back. He suppressed a grin. Maybe she likes you.
Are you trying to be funny?
Me?
Get that snake out of here.
Geryon put his hands behind his back. Not me, Zakath. I'll go get Sadi. In the hallway outside, however, he encountered Velvet, who was coming toward the Emperor's room with a mysterious smile on her face. Do you think you could move Zith? Geryon asked her. She's in the middle of Zakath's bed with those kittens. You can move her, Belgarian, the blonde girl said, smiling, the dimples into her cheeks. She trusts you. I think I'd rather not try that. The two of them went back into the Emperor's bedchamber.
Magrathain,
Zakath greeted her courteously, inclining his head. She curtsied. Your Majesty?
Can you deal with this?
He asked, pointing at the furry pile on his bed with the snake still half reared out of the center, her eyes alert. Of course, Your Majesty. She approached the bed, and the snake flickered her tongue nervously. Oh, do stop that, Zith, the blonde girl chided. Then she lifted the front of her skirt to form a kind of pouch, and began picking up kittens and depositing them in her improvised basket. Last of all, she lifted Zith and laid her in the middle. She crossed the room and casually put them all into the box with the mother cat, who opened one golden eye, made room for her kittens and their bright green nursemaid, and promptly went back to sleep. Isn't that sweet? Velvet murmured softly. Then she turned back to Zakath. Oh, by the way, Your Majesty, Keldar and I managed to find out who it was who poisoned you.
What?
She nodded, frowning slightly. It came as something of a surprise, actually. The Emperor's eyes had become intent.
You are sure?
As sure as one can be in these cases. You seldom find an eyewitness to a poisoning. But he was in the kitchen at the right time. He left right after you fell ill, and we know him by reputation.
She smiled at Geryon.
Have you noticed how people always tend to remember a man with white eyes?
Naradas? Geryon exclaimed.
Surprising, isn't it?
Who is Naradas?
He works for Zandramas, Geryon replied. He frowned. That doesn't make any sense, Velvet. Why would Zandramas want to kill him? Wouldn't she want to keep him alive? She spread her hands.
I don't know, Belgarian. Not yet, anyway.
Velvet? Zakath asked in puzzlement. She smiled, the dimples into her cheeks again.
Isn't it silly?
She laughed.
I suppose these little nicknames are a form of affection, though. Belgarian's question is to the point, however. Can you think of any reason why Zandramas might want to kill you?
Not immediately. But we can wring that answer out of her when I catch her, and I will make a point of doing that, even if I have to take Tolmurgos apart, stone by stone.
She isn't here, Geryon said absently, still struggling with the whole idea. She's at Ashaba, in the house of Torak.
Zakath's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Isn't this convenient, Belgarian? I happened to get poisoned right after your arrival. Belgarath happens to cure me. Keldar and Lizel happen to discover the identity of the poisoner, who happens to work for Zandramas, who happens to be at Ashaba, which happens to be in Malloreon, a place which just happens to be where you so desperately want to go. The coincidence staggers the imagination, wouldn't you say?
Zakath, you're starting to make me tired, Geryon said irritably. If I decide that I need a boat to get to Malloreon, I'll take one. All that's kept me from doing that so far are the manners Lady Polgara drilled into me when I was a boy.
And how do you propose to leave this house?
Zakath snapped, his temper also starting to rise. That did it. The rage that came over Geryon was totally irrational. It was the result of 100 delays and stumbling blocks, and petty interruptions that had dogged him for almost a year now. He reached over his shoulder, ripped Iron-Grip's sword from its sheath, and peeled the concealing leather sleeve from its hilt. He held the great blade before him, and literally threw his will at the orb. The sword exploded into blue flame. "How do I propose to leave this house?" he half shouted at the stunned Emperor. "I'll use this for a key. It works sort of like this." He straightened his arm, leveling the blazing sword at the door. "Burst!" he commanded. Geryon's anger was not only irrational, it was also somewhat excessive. He had intended no more than the door, and possibly a part of the door frame, simply to illustrate to Zakath the intensity of his feelings about this entire matter. The orb, however, startled into wakefulness by the sudden jolt of his angry will, had overreacted. The door certainly disappeared, dissolving into splinters that blasted out into the hallway. The door frame also vanished. What Geryon had not intended, however, was what happened to the wall. White-faced and shaking, Zakath stumbled back, staring at the hallway outside that had suddenly been revealed, and at the rubble that filled it, rubble that had a moment before been the solid 2-foot-thick stone wall of his bedroom. "My goodness," Velvet murmured mildly. Knowing that it was silly and melodramatic, but still caught up in the towering irrational anger, Geryon caught the stunned Zakath by the arm with his left hand and gestured with the sword he held in his right. "Now, we are going to talk with Belgarath," he announced.
We will go through the hallways if you'll give me your word not to call soldiers every time we go around a corner. Otherwise, we'll just cut straight through the house. The library is sort of in that direction, isn't it? He pointed at one of the still-standing walls with his sword.
Bulgarian,
Velvet chided him gently.
Not really. That's no way to behave. Kalzakath has been a very courteous host. I am sure that now that he understands the situation, he will be more than happy to cooperate. Won't you, your Imperial Majesty?
She smiled winsomely at the Emperor.
We wouldn't want the Riven King to get really angry, now would we? There are so many breakable things about. Windows, walls, houses, the city of Rak Hagga, that sort of thing.
They found Belgarath in the library again. He was reading a small scroll, and there was a large tankard at his elbow. "Something's come up," Geryon said shortly as he entered.
"Oh?"
"Velvet tells us that she and Silk found out that it was Naradas who poisoned Zakath."
"Naradas?" The old man blinked. "Well, that's a surprise, isn't it?"
"What's she up to, Grandfather? Xandramas, I mean."
"I'm not sure."
Belgarath looked at Zakath.
"Who is likely to succeed you if somebody manages to put you to sleep?"
Zakath shrugged.
"There are a few distant cousins scattered about, mostly in the Messine Islands and Karanda. The line of the succession is a little murky."
Perhaps that is what she has in mind, Belgarath,
Velvet said seriously.
If there is any truth in that Grolem prophecy you found in Rak Hagga, she's got to have an Angrak king with her at the time of the final meeting. A tame king would suit her purposes much better than someone like His Majesty here, some third or fourth cousin she could crown and anoint and proclaim king. Then she could have her Grolems keep an eye on him, and deliver him to her at the proper time.
It's possible, I suppose," he agreed. "I think there may be a bit more to it than that, though. Xandramas has never been that straightforward about anything before." "I hope you all realize that I have not the faintest notion of what you are talking about," Zakath said irritably. "Just how much does he know?" Belgarath asked Geryon.
"Not very much, Grandfather."
"All right. Maybe if he does know what is going on, he won't be quite so difficult."
He turned to the Malloreon Emperor.
"Have you ever heard of the Mrin Codex? I have heard that it was written by a madman, like most of the other so-called prophecies. How about the Child of Light and the Child of Dark? That is part of the standard gibberish used by religious hysterics. Zakath, you are going to have to believe in something. This is going to be very difficult for you to grasp if you don't. Would you settle for a temporary suspension of skepticism?" the Emperor countered. "Fair enough, I suppose. All right, now, this gets complicated. So you are going to have to pay attention, listen carefully, and stop me if there is anything that you do not understand." The old man then proceeded to sketch in the ancient story of the accident that had occurred before the world had begun, and the divergence of the two possible courses of the future, and of the two consciousnesses which had somehow infused those courses. "All right," Zakath said. "That is fairly standard theology so far. I have had Grolems preaching the same nonsense since I was a boy." Belgarath nodded. "I just wanted to start this off from common ground." He went on, then, telling Zakath of the events spanning the aeons between the cracking of the world and the Battle of Omimbre. "Our point of view is somewhat different," Zakath murmured. It would be, Belgarath agreed. All right. There were 500 years between Vomimbre and the theft of the orb by Zadar, the apostate. Recovery, Zakath corrected. The orb was stolen from Tol Mishrek by Irongrip the thief, and by... He stopped, and his eyes suddenly widened as he stared at the seedy-looking old man. Yes, Belgarath said. I really was there, Zakath. And I was there 2,000 years before, when Torak originally stole the orb from my master. I have been sick, Belgarath, the Emperor said weakly, sinking into a chair. My nerves are not really up for too many of these shocks. Belgarath looked at him puzzled.
Their Majesties were having a little discussion,
Velvet explained brightly.
King Belgarion gave the Emperor a little demonstration of some of the more flamboyant capabilities of the sword of the Riven King. The Emperor was quite impressed. So was most everybody else who happened to be in that part of the house.
Belgarath gave Geryon a chill look. Playing again? He asked. Geryon tried to reply, but there was nothing he could really say. All right. Let's get on with this. Belgarath continued briskly. What happened after the emergence of Geryon here is all recent history, so I am sure that you are familiar with it. Geryon? Zakath asked. A more common and familiar form. Belgarion is a bit ostentatious, wouldn't you say? No more so than Belgarath. I have worn Belgarath for almost 7,000 years, Zakath, and I have sort of rubbed off the rough edges and corners. Geryon has only been wearing his bell for 12 years, and it still squeaks when he turns around too quickly. Geryon felt slightly offended by that. Anyway, the old man continued, after Torak was dead, Geryon and Zenedra got married. About a year or so ago, she gave birth to a son. Geryon's attention at that time was on the bear cult. Someone had tried to kill Zenedra, and had succeeded in killing the Riven warder. I have heard about that, Zakath said. Anyway, he was in the process of stamping out the cult. He stamps quite well, once he puts his mind to it, when someone crept into the citadel at Reva and abducted his infant son, my great-grandson. No, Zakath exclaimed. Oh, yes, Belgarath continued grimly. We thought that it was the cult, and marched to Rehon in Dresnia, their headquarters. But it was all a clever ruse. Xandromos had abducted Prince Geron and misdirected us to Rehon. The leader of the cult turned out to be Herakan, one of the henchmen of Ervon. Is this coming too fast for you? Zakath's face was startled, and his eyes had gone wide again. No, he said, swallowing hard. I think I can keep up. Well, there's not too much more. After we discovered our mistakes, we took up the abductor's trail. We know that she is going to Malloreon, to a place which is no more. That's where the Sardian is. We have to stop her, or at least arrive there at the same time. Zaratus believes that when we all arrive at this place which is no more, there is going to be one of those confrontations between the Child of Light and the Child of Dark, which have been happening since before the beginning of time, except that this is going to be the last one. She will choose between them, and that is supposed to be the end of it. I am afraid that it is at that point that my skepticism reasserts itself, Belgarath. You don't actually expect me to believe that these two shadowy figures that predate the world are going to arrive at this mysterious place to grapple once more, do you? What makes you think they are shadowy? The spirits that are at the core of the two possible destinies infuse real people to act as their instruments during these meetings. Right now, for example, Xandramas is the child of Dark. It used to be Torak, until Geryon killed him. And who is the child of Light? I thought that would be obvious.
Zakath turned to stare incredulously into Geryon's blue eyes.
You?
He gasped.
"Well, that's what they tell me,"
Geryon replied. Chapter 5. Kal Zakath, dread emperor of boundless Maloria, looked first at Belgarath, then again at Geryon, and finally at Velvet.
Why do I feel that I am losing control of things here? He asked. When you people came here, you were more or less my prisoners. Now, somehow, I am yours.
We told you some things you didn't know before. That is all, Belgarath told him.
Or some things that you cleverly made up.
Why would we do that?
I can think of any number of reasons. For the sake of argument, I will accept your story about the abduction of Belgeryon's son. But don't you see how that makes all your motives completely obvious? You need my aid in your search. All this mystical nonsense, and your wild story about Urget's parentage, could have been designed to divert me from my campaign here in Tolmurgos, and to trick me into returning with you to Maloria. Everything you have done or said since you came here could have been directed toward that end.
"Do you really think that we would do that?"
Geryon asked him.
Belgeryon, if I had a son, and someone had abducted him, I would do anything to get him back. I sympathize with your situation, but I have my own concerns, and they are here, not in Maloria. I'm sorry, but the more I think about this, the less of it I believe. I could not have misjudged the world so much. Demons, prophecies, magic, immortal old men. Oh, it's all been very entertaining, but I do not believe one word of it.
"Not even what the orb showed you about Urget?" Geryon asked.
Please, Belgeryon, don't treat me like a child.
Zakath's lips were twisted into an ironic smile.
Isn't it altogether possible that the poison had already crept into my mind? And is it not also possible that you, like any other of the charlatans who infest village fairs, used a show of mysterious lights and suggestions to make me see what you wanted me to see?
"What do you believe, Kal Zakath?"
Velvet asked him.
What I can see and touch. Precious little else.
"So great a skepticism," she murmured.
"Then you do not accept one single out-of-the-ordinary thing?"
Not that I can think of, no.
"Not even the peculiar gift of the seers at Kel? It has been fairly well documented, you know."
He frowned slightly.
Yes, he admitted. As a matter of fact, it has.
"How can you document a vision?" Geryon asked curiously.
The Grolums were seeking to discredit the seers,
Zakath replied.
They felt that the easiest way to do that was to have these pronouncements about the future written down, and then wait to see what happened. The bureaucracy was instructed to keep records. So far, not one of the predictions of the seers has proven false.
"Then you do believe that the seers have the ability to know things about the past, and the present, and the future, in ways that the rest of us might not completely understand?"
Zakath pursed his lips.
"All right, Margravine," he said reluctantly. "I will concede that the seers have certain abilities that have not been explained as yet."
"Do you believe that a seer could lie to you?"
"Good girl," Belgarath murmured approvingly. "No," Zakath replied after a moment's thought. "A seer is incapable of lying. Their truthfulness is proverbial."
"Well, then," she said with a dimpled smile, "all you need to do to find out if what we have told you is the truth is to send for a seer, isn't it?" "Lascelles, that could take weeks. We don't have that much time." "Oh, I don't think it would take all that long. If I remember correctly, Lady Polgara said that Andel summoned Zaradas when His Majesty here lay dying. I am fairly sure we could persuade her to do it for us again."
"Well, Zakath," Belgarath said, "will you agree to accept what Zaradas tells you is the truth?"
The Emperor squinted at him suspiciously, searching for some kind of subterfuge.
"You have manipulated me into a corner,"
he accused. He thought about it.
"All right, Belgarath. I will accept whatever Zaradas says as the truth. If you will agree to do the same."
"Done, then," Belgarath said. "Let's send for Andel and get on with this." As Velvet stepped out into the hall to speak with one of the guards who trailed along behind the Emperor wherever he went, Zakath leaned back in his chair.
"I cannot believe that I am even considering all the wild impossibilities that you have been telling me."
Garion exchanged a quick look with his grandfather, and then they both laughed.
"Something funny, gentlemen?"
"Just a family joke, Zakath," Belgarath told him. "Garion and I have been discussing the possible and the impossible since he was about 9 years old. He was even more stubborn about it than you are."
"It gets easier to accept after the first shock wears off," Garion added. "It's sort of like swimming in very cold water. Once you get numb, it doesn't hurt quite so much."
It was not long until Velvet re-entered the room with the hooded Andel at her side.
"I believe you said that the Seeress of Kel is your mistress, Andel,"
Zakath said to her.
"Yes, she is, Your Majesty."
"Can you summon her?"
"Her semblance, Your Majesty, if there is need, and if she will consent to come."
"I believe there is need, Andel. Belgarath has told me certain things that I have to have confirmed. I know that Zaradas speaks only the truth. Belgarath, on the other hand, has a more dubious reputation."
He threw a rather sly, sidelong glance at the old man. Belgarath grinned at him and winked.
"I will speak with my mistress, Your Majesty," Andel said, "and entreat her to send her semblance here. Should she consent, I beg of you to ask your questions quickly. The effort of reaching half around the world exhausts her, and she is not robust."
Then the Delasian woman knelt reverently and lowered her head, and Garion once again heard that peculiar murmur as of many voices, followed by a long moment of silence. Again, there was that same shimmer in the air. When it had cleared, the hooded and blindfolded form of Zaradas stood there.
"We thank you for coming, Holy Seeress,"
Zakath said to her, in an oddly respectful tone of voice.
"My guests here have told me certain things that I am loath to believe, but I have agreed to accept whatever you can confirm."
"I will tell thee what I can, Zakath," she replied. "Some things are hidden from me, and some others may not yet be revealed."
"I understand the limitations, Zaradas. Belgarian tells me that Urgot, the king of the Murgos, is not of the blood of Tar Urgas. Is this true?
It is, she replied simply. King Urgot's father was an Elon.
Are any of the sons of Tar Urgas still alive?
Nay, Zakath. The line of Tar Urgas became extinct some 12 years ago, when his last son was strangled in a cellar in Rak Hagga, upon the command of Oskatat, King Urgot's seneschal.
Zakath sighed and shook his head sadly. And so it has ended. My enemy's line passed unnoticed from this world in a dark cellar, passed so quietly that I could not even rejoice that they were gone, nor curse the ones who stole them from my grasp.
Revenge is a hollow thing, Zakath.
It is the only thing I have had for almost 30 years now.
He sighed again, then straightened his shoulders.
Did Zandramas really steal Belgarian's son?
She did, and now she carries him to the place which is no more.
And where is that?
Her face grew very still.
I may not reveal that,
she replied finally.
But the Sardian is there.
Can you tell me what the Sardian is?
It is 1/2 of the stone which was divided.
Is it really all that important?
In all of Angarak there is no thing of greater worth. The Grolums all know this. Urvan would give all of his wealth for it. Zandramas would abandon the adoration of multitudes for it. Manga would give his soul for it. Indeed, he hath done so already in his enlistment of demons to aid him. Even Agachak, Harak of Rak Hagga, would abandon his ascendancy in Tolmurgos to possess it.
How is it that a thing of such value has escaped my notice?
Thine eyes are on worldly matters, Zakath. The Sardian is not of this world. No more than the other half of the divided stone is of this world.
The other half?
That which the Angaraks call Tragyaska, and the men of the West call the Orb of Aldur. Tragsardius and Tragyaska were sundered in the moment which saw the birth of the opposing necessities.
Zakath's face had grown quite pale, and he clasped his hands tightly in front of him to control their trembling.
It is all true, then?
He asked in a hoarse voice.
All, Kal Zakath. All.
Even that Belgarian and Zandramas are the child of light and the child of dark?
Yes, they are.
He started to ask her another question, but she raised her hand.
My time is short, Zakath, and I must now reveal something of greater import unto thee. Know that thy life doth approach a momentous crossroads. Put aside thy lust for power and thy hunger for revenge. They are but childish toys. Return thou even to Malzeth to prepare thyself for thy part in the meeting which is to come.
My part?
He sounded startled.
Thy name and thy task are written in the stars.
And what task is this?
I will instruct thee when thou art ready to understand what it is that thou must do. First thou must cleanse thy heart of the grief and remorse which has haunted thee.
His face grew still, and he sighed.
I am afraid not, Saradas. What you ask is quite impossible.
Then thou wilt surely die before the seasons turn again. Consider what I have told thee, and consider it well, Emperor of Malloria. I will speak with thee anon.
And then she shimmered and vanished. Zakath stared at the empty spot where she had stood. His face was pale. His jaws were set.
Well, Zakath,
"Are you convinced?" asked Belgarath.
The Emperor rose from his chair and began to pace up and down.
"This is an absolute absurdity,"
he burst out suddenly in an agitated voice.
"I know,"
Belgarath replied calmly.
"but a willingness to believe the absurd is an indication of faith. It might just be that faith is the first step in the preparation that Saradas mentioned."
"It's not that I don't want to believe, Belgarath,"
Zakath said in a strangely humble tone.
"It's just—"
"Nobody said that it was going to be easy. But you have done things before that were not easy, haven't you?"
Zakath dropped into his chair again, his eyes lost in thought.
"Oh, why me?"
he said plaintively.
"Why do I have to get involved in this?"
Geryon suddenly laughed. Zakath gave him a cold stare.
"I'm sorry," Geryon apologized, "but I've been saying, 'Why me?' since I was about 14. Nobody has ever given me a satisfactory answer, but you get used to the injustice of it after a while."
"It's not that I'm trying to avoid any kind of responsibility, Belgarian. It's just that I can't see what possible help I can be. You people are going to track down Xandramas, retrieve your son, and destroy the Sardian. Isn't that about it?"
"It is a little more complicated than that," Belgarath told him. "Destroying the Sardian is going to involve something rather cataclysmic."
"I don't quite follow that. Can't you just wave your hand and make it cease to exist? You are a sorcerer, after all. Or so they say."
"That's forbidden," Geryon said automatically. "You can't unmake things. That's what Tuchik tried to do. And he destroyed himself."
Zakath frowned and looked at Belgarath.
"I thought you killed him."
"Most people do," the old man shrugged. "It adds to my reputation. So I don't argue with them."
He tugged at one earlobe.
"No," he said. "I think we are going to have to see this all the way through to the end. I'm fairly sure that the only way the Sardian can be destroyed is as a result of the final confrontation between the Child of Light and the Child of Dark."
He paused, then sat up suddenly, his face intent.
"I think Saradas slipped, and gave us something she had not intended, though. She said that the Grolem priesthood all desperately wanted the Sardian, and she included Minga in her list. Wouldn't that seem to indicate that Minga is also a Grolem?"
He looked at Andel.
"Is your young mistress subject to these little lapses?"
"Saradas cannot misspeak herself, Holy Belgarath,"
the healer replied.
"Isires does not speak in her own voice, but in the voice of her vision."
"Then she wanted us to know that Minga is, or was, a Grolem, and that the reason he is raising demons is to help him in his search for the Sardian."
He thought about it.
"There's another rather bleak possibility, too. It might just be that his demons are using him to get the Sardian for themselves. Maybe that's why they are so docile where he is concerned. Demons by themselves are bad enough. But if the Sardian has the same power as the orb, we definitely don't want it to fall into their hands."
He turned to Zakath.
"Well," he said. "Well, what? Are you with us or against us?" "Isn't that a little blunt?" "Yes, it is. But it saves time, and time is starting to be a factor."
Zakath sank lower in his chair, his expression unreadable.
I find very little benefit for me in this proposed arrangement.
You get to keep living, Geryon reminded him. Sarada said that you would die before spring if you don't take up the task that she's going to lay in front of you. Zakath's faint smile was melancholy, and the dead indifference returned to his eyes.
My life has not really been so enjoyable that I would consider going out of my way to prolong it, Belgarian.
Don't you think you're being just a little bit childish, Zakath? Geryon snapped. His temper was starting to heat up again. You're not accomplishing a single thing here in Tolmergos. There's not one solitary drop of Urga blood left for you to spill, and you've got a situation at home that verges on disaster. Are you a king, or an emperor, or whatever you call it, or are you just a spoiled child? You refuse to go back to Malzeth just because somebody told you that you ought to. You even dig in your heels when someone assures you that you will die if you don't go back. That's not only childish, it's irrational. And I don't have the time to try to reason with somebody whose wits have deserted him. Well, you can huddle here in Rak Hagga and nurse all your tired old griefs and disappointments until Soratis's predictions catch up with you, for all I care, but Garen is my son, and I am going to Malloreon. I've got work to do, and I don't have time to coddle you.
He had saved something up for last.
Besides, he added, in an insulting, offhand tone, I don't need you anyway. Zakath came to his feet, his eyes ablaze.
You go too far,
he roared, slamming his fist down on the table. Amazing, Geryon said sarcastically. You are alive, after all. I thought I might have to step on your foot to get any kind of a response out of you. All right, now that you're awake, let's fight.
What do you mean, fight?
Zakath demanded, his face still flushed with anger.
Fight about what?
About whether or not you are going with us to Malloreon.
Don't be stupid. Of course I am going with you. What we are going to fight about is your incredible lack of common courtesy.
Geryon stared at him for a moment and then suddenly doubled over in a gale of helpless laughter. Zakath's face was still red, and his fists were clenching and unclenching, and then a slightly sheepish expression came over his face, and he, too, began to laugh. Belgarath let out an explosive breath.
Geryon, he said irritably, let me know when you are going to do something like that. My veins are not what they used to be.
Zakath wiped at his eyes, though he was still laughing.
How long do you think it might take for you and your friends to get packed? He asked.
Not too long, Geryon replied. Why?
I am suddenly homesick for Malzeth. It is spring there now, and the cherry trees are in bloom. You and Zenedra will love Malzeth, Geryon.
Geryon was not entirely sure if the omission of Bel was inadvertent or an overture of friendship. He was, however, quite sure that the Emperor of Malloreon was a man of even greater complexity than he had imagined.
I hope you will all excuse me now, but I want to talk with Bredor and get a few more details about what is going on in Karanda. This Menga he told me about seems to be mounting an open insurrection against the crown, and I have always had a violent prejudice against that sort of thing.
I can relate to that, Geryon agreed. For the next few days, the road between Rak Hagga and the port city of Rakhtan was thick with imperial messengers. Finally, on a frosty morning when the sun was bright and the sky dark blue, when misty steam rose from the dark waters of Lake Hagga, they set out, riding across a winter-browned plain toward the coast. Geryon, his grey raven cloak drawn about him, rode at the head of the column with Zakath, who seemed, for some reason,
to be in better spirits than he had been at any time since the two had met. The column which followed them stretched back for miles.
"Vulgar, isn't it?"
the Malloreon said wryly, looking back over his shoulder.
"I am absolutely surrounded by parasites and toadies, and they proliferate like maggots in rotten meat."
If they bother you so much, then why not dismiss them?
I can't. They all have powerful relatives. I have to balance them very carefully. One from this tribe to match the one from that clan. As long as no family has too many high officers, they spend all of their time plotting against each other. That way, they don't have the time to plot against me.
I suppose that's one way to keep things under control.
As the sun moved up through the bright blue winter sky at this nether end of the world, the frost gently dissolved from the long stems of dead grass, or fell lightly from the fern and bracken to leave ghostly white imprints of those drooping brown fronds on the short green moss spread beneath. They paused for a noon meal that was every bit as sumptuous as the one that might have been prepared back in Rak Hagga, and was served on snowy damask beneath a widespread canvas roof.
"Adequate, I suppose,"
Zakath said critically after they had eaten.
"You are over-pampered, my lord,"
Polgara told him.
"A hard ride in wet weather, and a day or so on short rations, would probably do wonders for your appetite."
Zakath gave Geryon an amused look.
"I thought it was just you. But this blunt outspokenness seems to be a characteristic of your whole family."
Geryon shrugged.
"It saves time."
"Forgive my saying this, Belgarian," Sadi interjected, "but what possible interest can an immortal have in time?"
He sighed rather mournfully.
"Immortality must give one a great deal of satisfaction, watching all one's enemies grow old and die."
"It is much overrated," Belgarath said, leaning back in his chair with a brimming silver tankard. "Sometimes whole centuries go by when one does not have any enemies, and there's nothing to do but watch the years roll by."
Zakath suddenly smiled broadly. "Do you know something?" he said to them all. "I feel better right now than I have felt in over 25 years. It is as if a great weight has been lifted from me."
"Probably an after-effect of the poison,"
Velvet suggested archly.
"Get plenty of rest, and it should pass in a month or so."
"Is she always like this?" Zakath asked.
"Sometimes. She's even worse," Silk replied morosely. As they emerged from beneath the wide-spread canvas, Geryon looked around for his horse, a serviceable roan with a long, hooked nose, but he could not seem to see the animal. Then he suddenly noticed that his saddle and packs were on a different horse, a very large dark gray stallion. Puzzled, he looked at Zakath, who was watching him intently.
"What's this?"
he asked.
"Just a little token of my unbounded respect, Geryon. Your roan was an adequate mount, I suppose, but he was hardly a regal animal. A king needs a kingly horse, and I think you will find that Chrétien can lend himself to any occasion that requires ceremony."
"Chrétien?"
"That's his name. He has been the pride of my stable here in Tolmurgos. Don't you have a stable at Riva?"
Geryon laughed. "My kingdom is an island, Zakath. We are more interested in boats than in horses."
He looked at the proud gray standing with his neck arched and with one hoof lightly pawing the earth, and was suddenly overcome with gratitude. He clasped the Malloreon Emperor's hand warmly.
"This is a magnificent gift, Zakath."
"Of course it is. I am a magnificent fellow. Or hadn't you noticed? Ride him, Geryon. Feel the wind in your face, and let the thunder of his hooves fill your blood."
Well, Geryon said, trying to control his eagerness, maybe he and I really ought to get to know each other. Zakath laughed with delight. Of course, he said. Geryon approached the big gray horse, who watched him quite calmly. I guess we'll be sharing a saddle for a while, he said to the animal. Chrétien nickered and nudged at Geryon with his nose. He wants to run, Ariond said. I'll ride with you if you don't mind. Horse wants to run too. All right, Geryon agreed. Let's go then. He gathered the reins, set his foot in the stirrup, and swung up into the saddle. The gray was running almost before Geryon was in place. It was a new experience. Geryon had spent many hours riding, sometimes for weeks on end. He had always taken care of his mounts, as any good Sindar would, but there had never really been any personal attachment before. For him, a horse had simply been a means of conveyance, a way to get from one place to another, and riding had never been a particular source of pleasure. With this great stallion, Chrétien, however, it was altogether different. There was a kind of electric thrill to the feel of the big horse's muscles bunching and flowing beneath him. They ran out across the winter-browned grass toward a rounded hill a mile or so distant, with Ariond and his chestnut stallion racing alongside. When they reached the hilltop, Geryon was breathless and laughing with sheer delight. He reined in, and Chrétien reared, pawing at the air with his hooves, wanting to be off again. Now you know, don't you? Ariond asked with a broad smile. Yes, Geryon admitted, still laughing. I guess I do. I wonder how I missed it all these years. You have to have the right horse, Ariond told him wisely. He gave Geryon a sidelong glance. You know, you'll never be the same again, don't you? That's all right, Geryon replied. I was getting tired of the old way anyhow. He pointed at a low string of hills outlined against the crisp blue sky, a league or so on ahead. Why don't we go over there and see what's on the other side? Why not? Ariond laughed. And so they did. The Emperor's household staff was well organized, and a goodly number of them rode on ahead to prepare their night's encampment at a spot almost precisely halfway to the coast. The column started early the following morning, riding again along a frosty track beneath a deep blue sky. It was late afternoon when they crested a hill to look out over the expanse of the Sea of the East, rolling a dark blue under the winter sun, and with smoky-looking cloud banks the color of rust blurring the far horizon. 24 ships, with their red sails furled, stood at anchor in the indented curve of a shallow bay far below, and Geryon looked with some puzzlement at Zakath. Another symptom of the vulgar ostentation I mentioned, the Emperor shrugged. I ordered this fleet down here from the port at Xtan. A dozen or so of those ships are here to transport all of my hangers-on and toadies, as well as the humbler people who actually do the work. The other dozen are here to escort our royal personages with suitable pomp. You have to have pomp, Geryon. Otherwise people might mistake a king or an emperor for an honest man. You're in a whimsical humor this afternoon. Maybe it is another of those lingering symptoms Dessau mentioned. We will sleep on board ship tonight, and sail at first light tomorrow. Geryon nodded, touching Chrétien's bowed neck with an odd kind of regret, as he handed his reins to a waiting groom. The vessel to which they were ferried from the sandy beach was opulent. Unlike the cramped cabins on most of the other ships Geryon had sailed aboard, the chambers on this one were nearly as large as the rooms in a fair-sized house. It took him a little while to pin down the reason for the difference. The other ships had devoted so little room to cabins because the bulk of the space on board had been devoted to cargo. The only cargo this ship customarily carried, however, was the Emperor of Malloria. They dined that evening on lobster, served in the low-beamed dining room aboard Zakath's floating palace. So much of Gerion's attention for the past week or more had been fixed on the unpredictable emperor that he had not had much opportunity to talk with his friends. Thus, when they took their places at the table, he rather deliberately sat at the opposite end from the Malloreon. It was with a great deal of relief that he took his seat between Polgara and Dernick, while Cenedra and Velvet diverted the Emperor with sparkling feminine chatter.
"You look tired, Gerion," Polgara noted. "I have been under a certain strain," he replied. "I wish that man would not keep changing every other minute. Every time I think I've got him figured out, he turns into somebody else." "It's not a good idea to categorize people, dear," she advised placidly, touching his arm. "That is the first sign of fuzzy thinking."
"Are we actually supposed to eat these things?"
Dernick asked in a disgusted sort of voice, pointing his knife at the bright red lobster staring up at him from his plate, with its claws seemingly at the ready.
"That's what the pliers are here for, Dernick,"
Polgara explained in a peculiarly mild tone.
"You have to crack it out of its shell."
He pushed his plate away.
"I'm not going to eat something that looks like a big red bug,"
he declared with uncharacteristic heat.
"I draw the line at some things."
"Lobster is a delicacy, Dernick," he grunted.
"Some people eat snails, too."
Her eyes flashed, but then she gained control of her anger and continued to speak to him in that same mild tone.
"I am sure we can have them take it away and bring you something else."
He glared at her. Gerion looked back and forth between the two of them. Then he decided that they had all known each other for far too long to step delicately around any problems.
"What's the matter, Dernick?" he asked bluntly. "You're as cross as a badger with a sore nose."
"Nothing,"
Dernick almost snapped at him.
Gerion began to put a few things together. He remembered the plea Andal had made to Aunt Paul concerning Toth. He looked down the table to where the big mute, his eyes lowered to his plate, seemed almost to be trying to make himself invisible. Then he looked back at Dernick, who kept his face stiffly turned away from his former friend. "Oh," he said. "Now I think I understand. Aunt Paul told you something you did not want to hear. Someone you liked very much did something that made you angry. You said some things to him that you wish now you hadn't said. Then you found out that he didn't really have any choice in the matter, and that what he did was really right after all. Now you would like to make friends with him again, but you don't know how. Is that sort of why you're behaving this way, and being so impolite to Aunt Paul?"
Dernick's look was at first stricken, then his face grew red, then pale.
"I don't have to listen to this,"
he burst out, coming to his feet.
"Oh, sit down, Dernick," Gerion told him. "We all love each other too much to behave this way. Instead of being embarrassed and bad-tempered about it, why don't we see what we can do to fix it?"
Dernick tried to meet Gerion's eyes, but finally lowered his head, his face flaming.
"I treated him badly, Gerion," he mumbled,
sinking back into his chair again.
"Yes," Gerion agreed. "You did. But it was because you did not understand what he was doing and why. I didn't understand myself until the day before yesterday, when Zakath finally changed his mind and decided to take us all to Malzeth. Tiratis knew that he was going to do that, and that's why she made Toth turn us over to Ataska's men. She wants us to get to the Sardian and meet Xandromas, and so she's going to arrange it. Toth will be the one who does what she thinks has to be done to accomplish that. Under the present circumstances, we couldn't find a better friend."
"How can I possibly, after the way I treated him?"
"Be honest. Admit that you were wrong, and apologize."
Dernick's face grew stiff.
"It doesn't have to be in words, Dernick," Gerion told his friend patiently. You and Toth have been talking together without words for months." He looked speculatively up at the low-beamed ceiling. "This is a ship," he noted, "and we are going out onto an ocean. Do you imagine that there might be a few fish out there in all of that water?" Dernick's smile was immediate. Polgara's sigh, however, was pensive. The smith looked almost shyly across the table.
"How did you say that I'm supposed to get this bug out of its shell, Paul?" he asked, pointing at the angry-looking lobster on his plate. They sailed northeasterly from the coast of Hagga, and soon left winter behind. At some point during the voyage they crossed that imaginary line equidistant from the poles, and once again entered the northern half of the world. Dernick and Toth, shyly at first, but then with growing confidence, resumed their friendship and spent their days at the ship's stern, probing the sea with lines, bright-colored lures, and various baits gleaned from the galley. Sakath's humor continued to remain uncharacteristically sunny, though his discussions with Belgarath and Polgara centered on the nature of demons, a subject about which there was very little to smile. Finally, one day, when they had been at sea for about a week, a servant came up to Geryon, who stood at the port-side rail watching the dance of the wind atop the sparkling waves, and advised him that the Emperor would like to see him. Geryon nodded, and made his way aft to the cabin where Zakath customarily held audience. Like most of the cabins aboard this floating palace, this one was quite large and ostentatiously decorated. Owing to the broad windows stretching across the ship's stern, the room was bright and airy. The drapes at the sides of the windows were of crimson velvet, and the fine Malloreon carpet was a deep blue. Zakath, dressed as always in plain white linen, sat on a low, leather-upholstered divan at the far end of the cabin, looking out at the white caps and the flock of snowy gulls trailing his ship. His cat lay purring in his lap as he absently stroked her ears. "You wanted to see me, Zakath?" Geryon asked as he entered. "Yes. Come in, Geryon," the Malloreon replied. "I have not seen much of you for the past few days. Are you cross with me?"
"No," Geryon said. "You've been busy learning about demons. I don't know that much about them, so I couldn't have added all that much to the discussion." He crossed the cabin, pausing at one point to stoop and unwrap a ferociously playful kitten from around his left ankle.
"They love to pounce,"
Zakath smiled. A thought came to Geryon, and he looked around warily. "Zith isn't in here, is she?"
Zakath laughed. "No, Sadi has devised a means of keeping her at home."
He looked whimsically at Geryon.
"Is she really as deadly as he says?"
Geryon nodded. "She bit a Grolem at Rak Hagga. He was dead in about a half a minute." Zakath shuddered.
"You don't have to tell Sadi about this, but snakes make my flesh creep."
"Talk to Silk. He can give you a whole dissertation about how much he dislikes them."
"He is a complicated little fellow, isn't he?"
Geryon smiled. "Oh, yes. His life is filled with danger and excitement. And so his nerves are as tightly wound as lute strings. He's erratic sometimes, but you get used to that after a while." He looked at the other man critically. "You're looking particularly fit," he noted, sitting down on the other end of the leather couch. "Sea air must agree with you."
"I don't think it's really the air, Geryon. I think it has to do with the fact that I have been sleeping 8 to 10 hours a night."
"Sleep? You?"
"Astonishing, isn't it?"
Zakath's face went suddenly quite somber.
"I would rather that this did not go any further, Geryon."
"Of course."
"Urget told you what happened when I was young?"
Geryon nodded. "Yes."
"My habit of not sleeping very much dates from then," A face that had been particularly dear to me haunted my dreams, and sleep became an agony to me.
That didn't diminish? Not even after some 30 years?
Not one bit. I lived in continual grief and guilt and remorse. I lived only to revenge myself on Tar Urgas. Kohag's saber robbed me of that. I had planned a dozen different deaths for the madman, each more horrible than the one before. But he cheated me by dying cleanly in battle.
No, Geryon disagreed. His death was worse than anything you could have possibly devised. I have talked with Kohag about it. Tar Urgas went totally mad before Kohag killed him, but he lived long enough to realize that he had finally been beaten. He died biting and clawing at the earth in frustration. Being beaten was more than he could bear. Zakath thought about it.
Yes, he said finally. That would have been quite dreadful for him, wouldn't it? I think that maybe I am less disappointed now.
And was it your discovery that the Urga line is now extinct that finally laid the ghost that has haunted your sleep all these years to rest?
No, Geryon. I don't think that had anything to do with it. It is just that instead of the face that had always been there before, now I see a different face.
Oh?
A blindfolded face.
Saradas? I don't know that I'd recommend thinking about her in that fashion.
You misunderstand, Geryon. She's hardly more than a child, but somehow she has touched my life with more peace and comfort than I have ever known. I sleep like a baby, and I walk around all day with this silly euphoria bubbling up in me. Frankly, I cannot stand myself like this, but I can't help it for some reason.
Geryon stared out the window, not even seeing the play of sunlight on the waves, nor the hovering gulls. And then it came to him so clearly that he knew that it was undeniably true. It's because you've come to that crossroads in your life that Saradas mentioned. You are being rewarded because you have chosen the right fork.
Rewarded?
By whom? Geryon looked at him and suddenly laughed. I don't think you are quite ready to accept that information yet. Could you bring yourself to believe that it's Saradas who is making you feel good right now?
In some vague way, yes.
It goes a little deeper, but that's a start. Geryon looked at the slightly perplexed man in front of him. You and I are caught up together in something over which we have absolutely no control. I've been through it before, so I will try to cushion the shocks that are in store for you as much as I can. Just try to keep an open mind about a peculiar way of looking at the world.
He thought about it some more.
I think that we are going to be working together, at least up to a point, so we might as well be friends.
He held out his right hand. Zakath laughed. Why not? He said, taking Geryon's hand in a firm grip. I think we are both as crazy as Tar Urgas. But why not? We are the two most powerful men in the world. We should be deadly enemies, and you propose friendship. Well, why not?
He laughed again delightedly. We have much more deadly enemies, Zakath, Geryon said gravely. And all of your armies, and all of mine, won't mean a thing when we get to where we are going.
And where is that, my young friend?
I think it's called The Place Which Is No More.
I have been meaning to ask you about that. The whole phrase is a contradiction in terms. How can you go someplace which does not exist anymore?
I don't really know. I'll tell you, though, when we get there.
2 days later, they arrived at Mal Gamila,
a port in southern Maloria, Antiqua, and took to horse. They rode eastward at a canter on a well-maintained highway that crossed a pleasant plain green with spring. A regiment of red-tunicked cavalrymen cleared the road ahead of them, and their pace left the entourage which usually accompanied the emperor far behind. There were way stations along the highway, not unlike the Tolnedran hostels dotting the roads in the west, and the Imperial Guard rather brusquely ejected other guests at these roadside stops to make way for the Emperor and his party. As they pressed onward day after day, Geryon began slowly to comprehend the true significance of the word boundless as it was applied to Maloria. The plains of Elgeria, which had always before seemed incredibly vast, shrank into insignificance. The snowy peaks of the Delesian Mountains, lying to the south of the road they traveled, raked their white talons at the sky. Geryon drew in on himself, feeling smaller and smaller the deeper they rode into this vast domain. Peculiarly, Sinedra seemed to be suffering a similar shrinkage, and she quite obviously did not like it very much. Her comments became increasingly waspish, her observations more acid. She found the loose-fitting garments of the peasantry uncouth. She found fault with the construction of the gang-plows that opened whole acres at a time behind patiently plodding herds of oxen. She didn't like the food, even the water, as clear as crystal and as cold and sweet as might have sprung from any crevice in the Tolnedran mountains, offended her taste. Silk, his eyes alight with mischief, rode at her side on the sunny mid-morning of the last day of their journey from Malgamilla. "Oh, beware, your majesty," he warned her slyly, as they neared the crest of a hillside sheathed in pale spring grass, so verdant that it almost looked like a filmy green mist. "The first sight of Malzeth has sometimes struck the unwary traveler blind. To be safe, why don't you cover one eye with your hand? That way you can preserve at least partial sight." Her face grew frosty, and she drew herself to her full height in her saddle, a move that might have come off better had she been only slightly taller, and said to him in her most imperious tone,
"We are not amused, Prince Keldar, and we do not expect to find a barbarian city at the far end of the world, a rival to the splendors of Tolhanath, the only truly imperial city in the—"
And then she stopped, as they all did. The valley beyond the crest stretched not for miles, but for leagues, and it was filled to overflowing with the city of Malzeth. The streets were as straight as tautly stretched strings, and the buildings gleamed, not with marble, for there was not marble enough in all of the world to sheath the buildings of this enormous city, but rather with an intensely gleaming thick white mortar that seemed somehow to shoot light at the eye. It was stupendous.
"It's not much,"
Zakath said, in an exaggeratedly deprecating tone.
"Just a friendly little place that we like to call home."
He looked at Sinedra's stiff, pale little face with an artful expression.
"We really should press on, your majesty," he told her. "It is a half-day's ride to the imperial palace from here."